It began not with legend, but with motion. Steel moved before it was famous. Engines turned before anyone knew the names painted on the hulls. The 4th Armored Division was born into a war that demanded speed, flexibility, and relentless forward pressure. A kind of warfare that did not pause to admire preparation, only to test it. From the beginning, this division was shaped by movement, by the idea that standing still meant falling behind, and that survival depended on reaching the next objective before the enemy could recover. The men who filled its ranks came from everywhere: farm towns, cities, quiet places, and loud ones. Some had never seen a tank before training. Others learned quickly that armored warfare was not just about machines, but about coordination, trust, and nerves of steel. A tank was powerful, yes, but only if it moved at the right time, with the right support, in the right direction. Alone, it was vulnerable. Together, it became something else entirely. Training turned civilians into crewmen, loaders, gunners, drivers, commanders. They learned the weight of steel, the smell of fuel, the constant vibration that seeped into bones and never quite left. They learned to fight while enclosed in darkness, guided by instruments and shouted commands, trusting teammates they could not see. They learned that speed saved lives, and that hesitation cost them. By the time the 4th Armored Division reached Europe, it carried no illusions. Normandy was already burning. The hedgerows waited like walls, breaking formations, hiding ambushes, turning every advance into a puzzle solved under fire. Tanks that were meant to maneuver freely found themselves trapped in narrow lanes and sunken roads. Infantry clung close, knowing that survival depended on staying together. The division adapted, quickly. They learned to fight not just forward, but around, to probe, to feint, to punch through weak points and exploit them without waiting for permission. Commanders encouraged initiative. Crews learned to read the terrain instinctively. When resistance stiffened, they did not stall. They shifted. When openings appeared, they surged through. That mindset would define everything that followed. As the Allies broke out of Normandy, the 4th Armored Division surged forward like something finally unchained. Roads opened, space returned. The tanks rolled fast, pushing eastward across France with momentum that felt unstoppable. Villages flashed by. Bridges were seized just in time. Columns stretched for miles, engines roaring day and night. The division earned a reputation for speed, not reckless speed, but purposeful movement driven by clarity and confidence. But speed brings its own dangers. Supply lines strained, fuel ran low, crews slept where they stopped, beside their tanks, boots still on. German resistance stiffened at river lines and crossroads. Ambushes snapped shut in place that looked quiet moments before. Losses mounted. Machines burned. Men disappeared from formations that barely had time to grieve before moving again. Then winter arrived, and with it, the Ardennes. The 4th Armored Division did not enter the Battle of the Bulge as a defender. It entered as a response. When German forces smashed through thin lines and encircled American units at Bastogne, the call went out for relief. And once again, movement became everything. In snow and freezing wind, the division turned, regrouped, and drove north. Roads iced over, visibility vanished. German resistance was fierce, desperate, determined. Villages became battlegrounds. Forests swallowed sound and direction. Tanks crawled forward through terrain that punished every mistake. And still, they pushed. Day after day, mile by mile, the 4th Armored Division fought its way toward Bastogne, absorbing casualties, rerouting under fire, refusing to stop. When they finally broke through, opening a corridor to the besieged town, it was not a dramatic explosion of victory. It was a hard-earned connection, forged through exhaustion, coordination, and sheer refusal to fail. But the war did not end there. The division continued east, across rivers, through shattered cities, into Germany itself. Resistance grew more fragmented but no less dangerous. Civilians fled. Infrastructure collapsed. The pace slowed, then surged again. Tanks crossed bridges that might not hold. Infantry cleared streets that echoed with gunfire and silence in equal measure. By the final months of the war, the 4th Armored Division was seasoned, scarred, and profoundly effective. It had learned how to move through chaos without losing cohesion, how to strike hard and then keep going, how to adapt faster than the enemy could respond. What defined the division was not just where it fought, but how it fought, with momentum, with flexibility, with trust between crews and commanders, with an understanding that armored warfare was as much about judgment as it was about firepower. When the war ended, the tanks stopped moving. Engines cooled. Crews climbed out and looked at landscapes they would never see again. The division's story did not end in a single place, but in a long line of roads stretching backward through memory, from training grounds to hedgerows, from frozen forests to shattered cities. Tonight, we return to that journey, to the engines starting before dawn, to the long roads through France and Belgium, to the snow-choked paths leading to Bastogne, to the final push into a collapsing enemy heartland, to the men and machines that proved speed, when paired with discipline, could change the course of war. Before we continue, I want to ask you something quiet and personal. Where in the world are you listening from right now, and what hour has settled gently around you? And if these long, steady journeys through history help you slow your breathing, clear your thoughts, or feel quietly accompanied at the end of the day, consider subscribing and let these stories keep moving with you, wherever you are. The lead Sherman tank crashes through the final German roadblock at Bastogne, Belgium. Machine gun fire ricochets off its hull. The turret swings left, fires once, and a German anti-tank gun disintegrates in a ball of orange flame. Behind this single tank, an entire armored column stretches back 3 miles into the frozen countryside. They have driven 100 miles through enemy territory in less than 48 hours. Inside the besieged town of Bastogne, 10,000 American paratroopers have been surrounded for 6 days, ammunition running low, wounded filling every cellar, German tanks closing in from all sides. The men of the 101st Airborne have been told relief is impossible. The weather is too cold, the Germans too strong, the distance too far. Then they hear the unmistakable roar of American tank engines, and everything changes. This is the 4th Armored Division. You have never heard of them. That is the first mystery. They advanced 1,200 miles through enemy territory, more than any other American division in the European theater. They fought for 280 consecutive days without relief, from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Czechoslovakia. They killed or captured over 140,000 German soldiers, while suffering fewer casualties than almost any comparable unit. When General George Patton needed an impossible mission completed, he called them. When the German High Command tried to identify which American divisions were attacking them, they consistently overestimated the 4th Armored's size, sometimes reporting 3 separate divisions when it was actually 1. By the time the war ended in May of 1945, military historians were already calling them the most effective armored division America had ever fielded. Yet today, ask 100 people to name a famous World War II division, and 99 will mention the 101st Airborne, the 1st Infantry, the Marines at Iwo Jima. Almost none will mention the 4th Armored. This documentary tells their story. The statistics alone demand explanation. 1,260 miles of enemy territory conquered. That is roughly the distance from New York City to Miami, covered entirely through combat operations against the German Wehrmacht. 74 towns and cities liberated across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, and Czechoslovakia. Over 14,000 enemy vehicles destroyed or captured. These numbers represent 6 months of continuous offensive operations, conducted at a pace that seemed physically impossible. On a single day in August of 1944, elements of the 4th Armored advanced 25 miles through German defensive positions, a distance that would have taken weeks during World War I. Their casualty rate tells an even more remarkable story. 4,483 total casualties across the entire war. For comparison, the 1st Infantry Division, which fought with equal distinction, suffered over 21,000 casualties. The 4th Armored was not lucky. They were not facing weaker opposition. They were simply operating according to principles that the rest of the American Army had not yet fully understood. General George Patton gave them a nickname that explains everything. He called them Name Enough. No additional title was necessary. When Patton needed to break through the Normandy hedgerows, he called the 4th Armored. When he needed someone to rescue the surrounded paratroopers at Bastogne, he called the 4th Armored. When he needed to cross the Rhine River and drive into the heart of Germany faster than anyone thought possible, he called the 4th Armored. Other divisions had colorful names: the Big Red One, the Screaming Eagles, the Hell on Wheels. The 4th Armored needed no such branding. Their reputation was their name. German intelligence reports from late 1944 described them with a mixture of respect and fear. One captured document refers to them as erschreckend schnell, frighteningly fast. Another German after-action report from September of 1944 concludes with a stark assessment. The American 4th Armored Division is the best armored division we have faced in this war. This from an army that had pioneered armored warfare, that had conquered Poland in weeks and France in months. For them to acknowledge American superiority was nearly unprecedented. The division wore a distinctive patch, a red triangle containing 4 yellow track marks, representing 4 tank treads. Soldiers called it simply the 4. They were activated on April 15, 1941, at a place called Pine Camp in upstate New York, 8 months before Pearl Harbor brought America into the war. At that moment, they possessed no tanks. None. Training crews used trucks with the word tank painted on the sides. The United States Army was building an armored force from scratch, and the 4th Armored was part of that experiment. Nobody knew if the experiment would work. American military doctrine in 1941 was still fundamentally based on World War I principles: infantry advanced, artillery supported, cavalry scouted. Tanks were seen as infantry support weapons, slow-moving bunkers designed to break through trenches. The idea that tanks could operate independently, racing hundreds of miles ahead of infantry, striking deep into enemy rear areas, seemed radical to the point of recklessness. The 4th Armored would prove that this radical vision was not just possible, but devastating. 3 years of training separated the 4th Armored's activation in April of 1941 from their combat debut in France in July of 1944. 3 years of brutal preparation, conducted in conditions that killed 14 men before they ever saw combat. Their training grounds in upstate New York regularly hit temperatures of -20 degrees Fahrenheit in winter. This was not accidental. Their commander, Major General John Shirley Wood, deliberately chose to train in the harshest conditions available in the continental United States. He understood something that many of his peers did not: that modern war would reward units that could sustain operations regardless of weather, terrain, or exhaustion. While other armored divisions trained in the temperate climate of the American South, the 4th Armored learned to maintain tank engines in sub-zero temperatures, to clear ice from periscopes while under simulated fire, to coordinate radio communications when cold weather reduced battery life by half. When they reached Bastogne in December of 1944, and the temperature dropped to -10 degrees, and other units ground to a halt because their equipment froze, the 4th Armored kept moving. They had been preparing for that moment since 1941. The men themselves came from everywhere: farm boys from Iowa who had never seen a tank before enlistment, factory workers from Detroit who understood machinery but not warfare, college students who had put their education on hold. A significant number were draftees who had not volunteered for armored service at all. What united them was not background, but training intensity. The 4th Armored's training regimen was notorious within the Army for its difficulty: 72-hour continuous combat exercises where men operated on 2 hours of sleep per night, live fire drills where artillery shells landed within 50 yards of advancing tank columns, forced marches where tank crews had to dismount and physically push their vehicles when they became stuck, building the kind of mechanical intuition that would later save their lives in combat. Other divisions thought the 4th Armored's training bordered on abuse. General Wood's response was coldly pragmatic: better they suffer here than die in France. By the time they shipped overseas in December of 1943, the 4th Armored had lost men to training accidents, frostbite, and exhaustion. They had also become the most thoroughly prepared armored division in the American military. They arrived in England in early 1944 and waited. For 6 months they waited while the invasion of Normandy was planned and executed. They listened to reports of the D-Day landings on June 6th. They heard about the brutal hedgerow fighting that followed, where American divisions were grinding forward at costs that horrified even hardened commanders. The 4th Armored sat in England and trained more. They studied aerial reconnaissance photos of French terrain. They practiced radio communications procedures until every tank commander could coordinate with artillery and air support without thinking. They modified their equipment, adding extra machine guns, welding on additional armor made from spare tank tracks, waterproofing engines for the expected amphibious landing. When they finally landed in France on July 11, 1944, more than a month after D-Day, they were not reinforcements arriving to replace casualties. They were an exploitation force, held in reserve specifically for the moment when the German defensive line finally broke. That moment came 17 days later. On July 28, 1944, Operation Cobra shattered the German front in Normandy. American bombers dropped thousands of tons of explosives on a 5-mile section of German defensive positions near a town called Coutances. Infantry divisions attacked through the devastated landscape. Behind them, waiting for the signal, sat the 4th Armored Division. At 11 in the morning, they received the order to advance. Tank engines roared to life. Radio operators confirmed communications checks. Infantry squads mounted onto tank decks for the ride forward. General Wood transmitted a single message to all units. Find them, fix them, fight them, forget them. Do not stop to consolidate gains. Do not wait for reinforcements. If you encounter the enemy, destroy them and keep moving. If they resist, go around them. Never, under any circumstances, stop advancing. It was a philosophy that violated traditional military doctrine. It was also about to change the war. 7 days later, on August 4th, the 4th Armored Division sat 150 miles from where they had started. They had captured the city of Rennes in Brittany without fighting because the German garrison evacuated hours before their arrival. They had bypassed dozens of German strongpoints that other divisions would have spent weeks reducing. They had moved so fast that their own supply trucks could not keep pace, forcing them to capture German fuel depots just to keep their tanks running. French civilians in liberated towns reported the same story. American tanks arrived at dawn, the commander asked directions to the next town, and by noon the Americans were gone, leaving the French to wonder if they had imagined the whole encounter. German commanders were reporting chaos. American armored units were appearing in their rear areas, cutting supply lines, overrunning headquarters, disappearing before reinforcements could respond. The German 7th Army, which had held Normandy for weeks, was disintegrating, and at the spearhead of the American breakthrough, moving faster than anyone thought possible, was the 4th Armored Division. They had been in combat for 7 days. They would not stop for another 273 days. This is their story. April 15th, 1941, Pine Camp, New York. Snow still covers the ground in patches. The temperature hovers just above freezing. Major General Oscar Griswold stands before 11,000 men assembled on a muddy parade ground, officially activating the 4th Armored Division. Behind him, not a single tank is visible. There are no Shermans, no Grants, no Stuarts, just rows of recruits in wool uniforms, their breath steaming in the cold air, wondering what exactly they have signed up for. Griswold's speech is brief. Gentlemen, you are now part of an experiment. The United States Army is learning how to fight with tanks. You will help us learn. It is an admission of startling honesty. In April of 1941, the American military does not fully understand armored warfare. The Germans have been perfecting it for 2 years, conquering Poland, France, and much of Eastern Europe with coordinated tank attacks that move faster than defending armies can react. America is trying to catch up. The 4th Armored Division is part of that catch-up effort, and nothing about their beginning suggests future greatness. The location itself tells a story. Pine Camp, later renamed Fort Drum, sits in Jefferson County in upstate New York, less than 30 miles from the Canadian border. It is one of the coldest, most miserable training locations in the continental United States. Winter temperatures regularly drop below zero. Snow accumulates in feet, not inches. Winds blow across frozen Lake Ontario with nothing to stop them. This is not where you send soldiers if you want them comfortable. This is where you send them if you want them tough. The decision to activate an armored division in this climate was deliberate. Someone in the War Department understood that American tanks would eventually fight in Europe, which meant they would fight in European winters. French winters, German winters, Belgian winters, where temperatures could kill as efficiently as bullets. The 4th Armored would learn to operate in those conditions from the very beginning, or they would learn nothing at all. The early training was chaos. Without actual tanks, instructors improvised. Truck drivers painted "tank" on the sides of their vehicles and drove in formation, pretending their trucks were 30-ton Shermans. Infantry practiced mounting and dismounting from vehicles that bore no resemblance to the ones they would eventually use in combat. Artillery crews calculated firing solutions for supporting non-existent armored columns. Tank commanders stood in the backs of jeeps with broomsticks, simulating turret operation by yelling "boom" when they wanted to fire. Veterans later recalled this period with dark humor, but the improvisation served a purpose. The 4th Armored was learning combined arms coordination, how infantry, tanks, artillery, and engineers could work together as a single organism. This was revolutionary thinking. Most American divisions trained each component separately. Infantry learned infantry tactics. Tanks learned tank tactics. Artillery learned artillery tactics. Then they were thrown into combat and expected to figure out coordination under fire. The 4th Armored was doing it differently. From day one, rifle, squads trained alongside tank crews. Forward observers practiced calling artillery strikes while riding on tank decks. Engineers learned to clear obstacles while tanks provided covering fire. It was messy and confusing, and unlike anything the American Army had tried before. The first actual tanks arrived in summer of 1942, more than a year after the division's activation. They were M3 Lee medium tanks, and they were already obsolete. The Lee was a bizarre-looking vehicle, with its main 75mm gun mounted in a hull sponson that required the entire tank to turn to aim. It had a smaller 37mm gun in a turret on top, creating a tall, ungainly silhouette that made excellent target practice for enemy gunners. American tank designers had built the Lee as a stopgap measure, something to produce quickly while they developed better designs. The 4th Armored received 200 of them and started training immediately. Tank crews quickly discovered the Lee's flaws. The hull-mounted gun had limited traverse, making it nearly useless in defensive positions. The tank's height made it easy to spot and impossible to conceal. The riveted armor construction meant that shell impacts could cause rivets to pop loose inside the crew compartment, turning into deadly projectiles that killed crew members even when the armor held. But the 4th Armored trained with what they had. They learned the Lee's quirks, its mechanical weaknesses, its few advantages. More importantly, they learned how tanks broke down, how to perform field repairs, how to keep vehicles running despite mechanical failures that would have sidelined less trained crews. This knowledge would prove invaluable later when they were driving Shermans across France and breaking down was not an option. In July of 1942, command of the 4th Armored passed to Major General John Shirley Wood. He was 52 years old, a West Point graduate from the class of 1912. A World War I veteran who had spent the interwar years thinking deeply about armored warfare, while most of his peers ignored the subject. Wood was lean, intense, and suffered from chronic insomnia that had him working 20-hour days. His subordinates called him P. Wood behind his back, the P standing for professor, because he approached war like an intellectual problem to be solved through rigorous analysis. But there was nothing academic about his training methods. Wood believed that armor should never stop moving, not to consolidate gains, not to wait for infantry, not to establish defensive positions. Continuous offensive movement was the only doctrine that mattered. Everything else was details. His first speech to the division made this explicit. "Gentlemen, we're going to move faster and hit harder than any division in history. Some of you won't survive the training. All of you will survive the war." It was a promise that would prove half true. The training intensified immediately. Wood implemented 72-hour continuous combat exercises where units operated without sleep, simulating the exhaustion of sustained offensive operations. Officers who allowed their units to halt for rest were relieved on the spot. Tank crews that fell behind the advance were left behind to find their own way back, teaching them the consequences of mechanical failure. Live fire exercises pushed the boundaries of safety, with artillery shells landing danger close to advancing armor. 14 men died in training accidents during 1942 and early 1943. Broken bones, equipment malfunctions, vehicles rolling over in rough terrain, accidents with live ammunition. Each death brought criticism from higher headquarters, questions about whether Wood was pushing too hard, killing men needlessly before they even reached combat. Wood's response was always the same. The training was not too hard. War was harder. Every man who died in training represented lessons learned that would save 10 lives in combat. The numbers would eventually prove him right, but in 1942, that future vindication was invisible. What was visible was a commander who seemed to value speed and aggression over human life, and subordinates who were beginning to either worship or hate him with equal intensity. The winter of 1941 to 1942 tested everyone. Temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Tank engines would not start without elaborate preheating procedures. Tracks froze to the ground overnight. Gun mechanisms seized. Radio batteries died. Crews learned to sleep inside their tanks because the body heat kept the interior marginally warmer than outside. They learned which lubricants worked in extreme cold and which turned to sludge. They learned to clear ice from periscopes without scratching the glass. They learned to identify frostbite symptoms and treat them before fingers and toes turned black. Other armored divisions, training in Texas and California, thought the 4th Armored were fools for staying in New York through winter. Wood thought everyone else were fools for avoiding the conditions where real wars were fought. When the 4th Armored reached Bastogne in December of 1944, and the temperature was -10, and half the American divisions in the region were immobilized by frozen equipment, the 4th Armored kept their engines running and kept advancing. They had spent 3 winters preparing for exactly that moment. By late 1942, the division had received M4 Sherman medium tanks to replace the obsolete Lees. The Sherman was not perfect, but it was vastly superior to what they had been training with. It had a turret-mounted 75mm gun that could traverse 360 degrees, thicker armor, better reliability, lower profile. The crews modified them immediately, adding features that the factory had never considered. Extra track links welded to the hull as improvised armor, additional machine guns mounted for anti-infantry work, waterproofing improvements for the expected amphibious landing in France, stowage modifications that allowed crews to carry more ammunition and supplies than the official specifications permitted. Some of these modifications violated regulations. Wood encouraged them anyway. He wanted tank commanders who thought creatively, who understood their vehicles intimately enough to improve them, who would not wait for permission from higher headquarters to solve problems. This culture of tactical innovation, established during training, would become one of the 4th Armored's defining characteristics. The final phase of training occurred at the Desert Training Center in California, from late 1942 through mid-1943. The desert was the opposite of Pine Camp, hot instead of cold, dry instead of wet, but equally miserable. The 4th Armored conducted maneuvers across hundreds of square miles of empty terrain, learning how to navigate without landmarks, how to manage water and fuel across long distances, how to maintain formation when dust storms reduced visibility to zero. General Wood used the desert exercises to implement his task force doctrine. Instead of keeping the division unified, he split it into smaller combined arms teams, a tank battalion, an armored infantry battalion, an artillery battalion, some engineers, all under a single commander with orders to operate independently. This was radical. Standard doctrine kept divisions together as cohesive units. Wood was deliberately teaching his subordinates to fragment the division and reconstitute it on the fly, creating temporary battle groups tailored to specific missions. Task Force Alpha, Task Force Bravo, Task Force whatever the commander wanted to call it. Each task force would have everything it needed to fight independently: tanks for firepower, infantry for holding ground, artillery for support, engineers for obstacles. This organizational flexibility would prove decisive in France, allowing the 4th Armored to simultaneously attack in multiple directions while their opponents struggled to understand what they were facing. In December of 1943, the 4th Armored Division loaded onto transport ships at East Coast ports and sailed for England. 3 years of training were complete. They had started as 11,000 men with no tanks and no clear doctrine. They had become a combined arms instrument built around principles that the rest of the army was only beginning to understand: continuous offensive movement, decentralized command, combined arms integration, mechanical reliability, aggressive improvisation. They had trained in conditions that ranged from Arctic cold to desert heat. They had lost 14 men to accidents, but had learned lessons that no textbook could teach. They arrived in England in early 1944 and waited while the invasion of Europe was prepared. They did not know when they would enter combat. They did not know where they would land, but they knew exactly how they would fight. General Wood had spent 3 years making sure of that. Find them, fix them, fight them, forget them. Never stop moving. Speed is armor. Audacity saves lives. These principles seemed abstract in the training grounds of New York and California. They would seem very concrete in the hedgerows of Normandy, where the 4th Armored was about to prove that everything they had learned was either brilliantly correct or catastrophically wrong. There would be no middle ground. July 15, 1942. Pine Camp, New York. Major General John Shirley Wood walks among his tanks, running his hand along their armored flanks like a man inspecting horses. He is 52 years old, lean to the point of gauntness, with eyes that seem permanently shadowed by lack of sleep. He sleeps 3 to 4 hours per night, spending the rest of his time reading intelligence reports, studying maps, writing training directives that his staff will implement the next morning. His subordinates call him Professor Wood, sometimes to his face. He does not mind. He has been thinking about armored warfare for 20 years, while most of the American army ignored the subject entirely. Now he commands 11,000 men and 200 tanks, and he has exactly 2 years to transform them into something the German Wehrmacht has never encountered before. Everything depends on whether his theories, developed during 2 decades of peacetime speculation, actually work when people start shooting back. Wood believes they will. He has to believe they will. There is no time for doubt. Wood's military career began at West Point, class of 1912, the same class that produced Omar Bradley. He served in World War I as an artillery officer, watching from a distance as infantry battalions threw themselves at German machine gun positions in attacks that gained yards at costs measured in thousands of lives. The experience left him convinced that there had to be a better way to break defensive stalemates. After the war, while most officers returned to peacetime garrison duty and forgot everything they had learned, Wood transferred to the nascent Armored Corps and began writing theoretical papers about tank warfare. His central insight was simple but radical. Tanks should not support infantry. Tanks should replace cavalry. They should move fast, penetrate deep, avoid strong points, attack supply lines and command posts, create chaos in enemy rear areas. Let the infantry follow behind and clear up the mess. Wood's papers were read by almost no one. The army of the 1920s and 30s had no interest in radical theories. They wanted officers who followed doctrine, not visionaries who questioned it. Wood's career stagnated. He commanded small units, taught at branch, schools, and watched in frustration as the German army implemented exactly the kind of armored warfare he had been describing in papers that nobody read. When Wood took command of the 4th Armored in July of 1942, he finally had the opportunity to test his theories. His command philosophy could be summarized in 4 words: find, fix, fight, forget. Find the enemy through aggressive reconnaissance. Fix them in place with an initial engagement. Fight them just long enough to destroy their will to resist. Forget them and keep moving toward the next objective. Do not stop to count prisoners. Do not consolidate defensive positions. Do not wait for infantry to catch up. The objective is not to hold ground. The objective is to destroy the enemy's ability to coordinate a defense by moving faster than they can react. This philosophy required a different kind of organization than standard American divisions. Wood restructured the 4th Armored into 3 semi-autonomous combat commands: Combat Command A, Combat Command B, and Combat Command Reserve. Each combat command was essentially a miniature division, with its own tanks, infantry, artillery, and engineers. They could operate independently or combine for larger operations. More importantly, Wood could reorganize them on the fly, creating task forces built around specific missions. Need to capture a bridge? Task Force Smith gets a tank company, an infantry company, some engineers, and a radio link to division artillery. Need to exploit a breakthrough? Task Force Jones gets 2 tank battalions, mobile infantry, and orders to advance until they run out of fuel. This organizational flexibility became the 4th Armored's signature characteristic. Wood's training methods were brutal by design. He believed that units had to be pushed beyond their breaking point in training so they would never break in combat. 72-hour continuous exercises became standard. Tank crews would operate without sleep, making tactical decisions while exhausted, learning to function when their judgment was impaired by fatigue. Officers who allowed their units to rest during these exercises were relieved immediately, regardless of their previous performance. Wood's logic was merciless. If you stop during training, you will stop during combat, and stopping during combat gets people killed. The training accidents that resulted from this intensity brought criticism from higher headquarters. 14 dead before the division ever reached Europe, dozens more injured, questions about whether Wood cared more about his theories than about his men. But Wood never reduced the training intensity. His response to critics was always the same. I'm not training them for garrison duty, I'm training them to win. The men themselves had mixed feelings. Some hated Wood, saw him as a martinet who would sacrifice anyone to prove his doctrine correct. Others worshipped him, understanding that his ruthlessness was designed to keep them alive in situations where conventional thinking would get them killed. Wood's relationship with technology was surprisingly nuanced for an officer of his generation. He understood that tanks were not magic weapons that won battles through sheer mechanical superiority. The German Panthers and Tigers were better tanks than American Shermans in almost every measurable way. Thicker armor, more powerful guns, better optics. But Wood did not care. What mattered was reliability and speed of repair. A Panther that could not move because its transmission had failed was worth less than a Sherman that kept running, despite being shot multiple times. Wood drilled this into his maintenance crews. The 4th Armored had to maintain higher operational readiness rates than any other division. Every tank that broke down slowed the entire advance. Mechanics learned to perform field repairs that the technical manuals said were impossible. They learned to cannibalize damaged vehicles for parts. They learned to keep tanks running on captured German fuel when American supply lines fell behind. This emphasis on mechanical reliability made the 4th Armored different from other divisions. Other units treated maintenance as a support function, something that happened behind the lines. The 4th Armored treated maintenance as a combat skill, as important as gunnery or tactics. But Wood's most important innovation was radio doctrine. In 1942, most American armored units used radios primarily for command and control. Higher headquarters sent orders down to subordinate units. Wood turned this around. He wanted every tank commander to have a radio, and he wanted them to talk to each other constantly. Tank platoons coordinated their movements without waiting for orders from above. Forward observers riding in tanks called artillery strikes directly, cutting the response time from 20 minutes to 2 minutes. Infantry squad leaders could request tank support without going through battalion headquarters. This required more radios than the standard division allowance. So, Wood lobbied the Pentagon for additional equipment, arguing that communications were more important than additional armor. He got some of what he wanted, not all, but he established a culture where radio discipline meant using radios constantly, not maintaining radio silence. This was the opposite of German doctrine, which emphasized radio silence to prevent interception. Wood's approach was simpler. Talk as much as you want, but coordinate so well that the enemy cannot react, even when they know exactly what you're doing. Speed of execution beats operational security. Wood's personal command style was hands-off, to the point of appearing absent. Once his combat commands crossed the start line into enemy territory, he rarely gave specific tactical orders. Instead, he gave them objectives and expected them to figure out how to achieve those objectives using their own judgment. Take that town was a typical Wood order. How you took it, which route you used, whether you went around strong points or through them, that was up to the combat commander. This required Wood to select subordinate commanders who thought like he did, aggressively, independently, with complete focus on continuous forward movement. Colonels who wanted detailed instructions or who hesitated before making risky decisions did not last long under Wood's command. He relieved officers who showed excessive caution, promoted junior officers who showed initiative, and created a command climate where taking risks and failing was preferable to waiting for permission and missing opportunities. This style produced spectacular successes, but it also produced friction with higher headquarters. Third Army staff officers complained that Wood ignored orders, operated outside his assigned boundaries, and created coordination problems with adjacent divisions. These complaints would eventually cost Wood his command, but in the summer of 1944, when the 4th Armored was tearing across France, nobody was complaining very loudly. Wood's physical appearance reinforced his reputation as an intellectual warrior. He was thin, almost frail-looking, more professor than soldier. He wore reading glasses that he constantly removed and cleaned while thinking. He spoke quietly, without the theatrical bombast that characterized generals like Patton. Soldiers who met him for the first time often came away unimpressed, expecting someone who looked more conventionally heroic. But subordinates who worked with him understood that the quiet demeanor concealed absolute certainty about how armored warfare should be conducted. Wood never raised his voice because he never needed to. His orders were precise, his expectations clear. You executed his orders or you were replaced. There was no middle ground. This created a division where everyone understood exactly what was expected. Move fast, hit hard, never stop, improvise constantly, coordinate seamlessly. Simplicity became the 4th Armored's greatest strength. While other divisions struggled with complex operational plans that broke down under combat stress, the 4th Armored operated according to principles so simple that they could be executed even when communications failed and plans dissolved into chaos. By December of 1943, when the 4th Armored shipped to England to prepare for the invasion of Europe, Wood had created something unique in the American military. It was not the equipment. They had the same Shermans as everyone else. It was not the men. They came from the same cross-section of American society as every other division. What was unique was the training, the organization, and the doctrine. 3 years of preparation based on ideas that Wood had been developing since the 1920s. A division built around continuous offensive movement, decentralized command, combined, arms integration, mechanical, reliability, and aggressive improvisation. Whether this would work in actual combat remained to be seen. German armored divisions had been perfecting their doctrine since the invasion of Poland in 1939. They had 5 years of combat experience. The 4th Armored had none. But Wood was confident, or at least he projected confidence. He told his commanders that the 4th Armored would advance further and faster than any American division in history. Some thought he was delusional. Others thought he was brilliant. In 6 months, when the 4th Armored was driving through France at speeds that seemed impossible, everyone would realize he was simply correct. But that vindication lay in the future. In December of 1943, Wood was just another division commander with theories, boarding ships for England, hoping that everything he had built would survive contact with reality. July 20th, 1944. Normandy, France. A 4th Armored Sherman takes a direct hit from a German 75mm anti-tank gun. The armor-piercing round punches through the right side of the turret, passes between the loader and the gunner without hitting either man, and exits through the left side, leaving 2 holes the size of coffee cans. The tank commander, Sergeant Michael Delaney, stares at the holes for 3 seconds, then keys his radio. "We're hit but mobile. Continuing advance." The Sherman keeps moving. That night, division maintenance crews weld steel plates over both holes. The next morning, Delaney's tank is back in action. It will fight for 7 more months, accumulating 12 additional penetrations before the war ends. This story, multiplied across hundreds of tanks, explains something that confuses people who study World War II. The Sherman tank was inferior to German armor in almost every measurable way. Yet, American armored divisions using Shermans consistently defeated German panzer divisions using Panthers and Tigers. The 4th Armored Division's combat record makes this paradox impossible to ignore. The answer has nothing to do with American tanks being better. The answer has everything to do with American tanks being good enough, and everything else being better. The Sherman medium tank became the workhorse of American armored forces because it was the only design that could be produced in sufficient quantities to matter. It weighed 30 tons. Its main gun was either a 75mm or, in later variants, a 76mm cannon. Its frontal armor was 2 inches thick on the hull, 3 inches on the turret. It could travel about 25 miles per hour on roads, maybe 15 miles per hour cross-country. Range was roughly 120 miles before refueling. 5-man crew, commander, gunner, loader, driver, assistant driver who also operated the hull machine gun. These specifications were decidedly unimpressive compared to German heavy armor. The Panther tank, which the Germans introduced in 1943 and which the 4th Armored would face repeatedly, weighed 45 tons, mounted an 88mm gun that could penetrate Sherman armor at 2,000 yards, and had 4.5 inches of frontal armor that Sherman guns struggled to penetrate even at close range. The Tiger, even heavier and more powerfully armed, was essentially invulnerable to frontal assault by Shermans. On paper, the Germans had built superior tanks. On battlefields, they kept losing. The Sherman's first advantage was reliability. The powertrain was based on automotive components that American factories had been mass-producing for decades. The engine was a variant of what General Motors put into trucks. The transmission was based on commercial designs. When something broke, which happened constantly in armored warfare, Sherman crews could repair it with basic tools and commonly available parts. Contrast this with German tanks. The Panther used a sophisticated but fragile transmission that tended to fail after 40 to 50 miles of hard driving. When it broke, you needed specialized tools, trained mechanics, and replacement parts that were in chronically short supply because German factories could not keep up with demand. American logistics could deliver spare parts to forward units within 24 hours. German logistics struggled to deliver spare parts at all. The 4th Armored maintained operational readiness rates above 90% throughout the war. This meant that at any given time, 90 out of every 100 tanks were capable of combat operations. German panzer divisions rarely achieved readiness rates above 60%. Having superior tanks meant nothing if those tanks could not move. The second advantage was repairability in combat conditions. Sherman tanks were designed for ease of maintenance by crews with moderate mechanical skills. Engine compartments were accessible through large hatches. Track and suspension components could be replaced without specialized equipment. Most importantly, Shermans that were knocked out could often be recovered and returned to service. A Sherman with a penetrated turret, like Sergeant Delaney's tank from the opening of this chapter, could be patched and made combat-ready in hours. Even Shermans that suffered catastrophic damage could be cannibalized for parts, their engines and transmissions transplanted into other damaged vehicles. The 4th Armored's maintenance companies became experts at field-expedient repairs that the technical manuals said were impossible. Welding armor patches over penetrations, swapping out damaged turrets, rebuilding suspensions using parts from 3 different wrecked tanks. At one point during the pursuit across France, the division's maintenance units were returning 3 damaged Shermans to service for every 1 new Sherman they received from rear area depots. This meant the division's effective tank strength actually grew during sustained combat operations, while German panzer divisions steadily weakened as their irreparable Panthers and Tigers accumulated behind the front lines. The third advantage was production volume. The United States built 49,234 Sherman tanks during World War II. Germany built approximately 6,000 Panthers and 1,300 Tigers. These numbers reflect different industrial philosophies. American factories were optimized for mass production of adequate weapons. German factories pursued technical perfection in limited quantities. The result was that American armored divisions always had more tanks than they needed, while German panzer divisions were always undermanned. The 4th Armored Division was allocated approximately 600 Shermans throughout its combat service. They lost approximately 450 tanks to enemy action, but because destroyed Shermans were constantly replaced, the division never had to reduce its operational strength. Crew casualties were replaced. New Shermans arrived from depots. The division kept attacking. German panzer divisions, by contrast, began campaigns at full strength and ended them with a fraction of their original vehicles, unable to replace losses because replacement tanks did not exist. Quantity has a quality all its own, as someone once said. The 4th Armored proved it. The fourth advantage, less tangible but equally important, was crew training. The 4th Armored's tank crews had trained together for 18 months before entering combat. They knew their vehicles intimately. They understood mechanical tolerances, knew which sounds indicated developing problems, could perform emergency repairs without consulting manuals. Driver training emphasized smoothness over speed, understanding that harsh handling broke tracks and transmissions. Gunners trained on realistic ranges where they learned to estimate distance, compensate for terrain, engage moving targets. Commanders learned to fight their tanks as teams, coordinating with adjacent tanks, integrating with infantry and artillery. By the time 4th Armored Shermans entered combat in July of 1944, their crews were as prepared as intensive training could make them. German tank crews in 1944 were increasingly undertrained. Experienced crew members had been killed off during years of combat on the Eastern Front. Replacements received 6 to 8 weeks of training before being sent to the front. They did not know their vehicles well. They made mistakes that got them killed. Superior equipment could not compensate for inferior training. The Sherman had vulnerabilities that no amount of training could eliminate. The gasoline engine made them more flammable than German diesel-powered tanks. Early Shermans stored ammunition in sponsons inside the crew compartment, meaning a penetrating hit often ignited ammunition and killed everyone. Inside. The thin armor meant that German anti-tank guns could penetrate Shermans at extreme range, while Shermans had to close to danger-close distances to have any chance of penetrating German armor. These vulnerabilities were real, and 4th Armored crews understood them intimately. They dealt with them through tactics, not technology. Shermans avoided frontal engagements with Panthers whenever possible, using speed and maneuverability to get to the sides or rear, where German armor was thinner. They used terrain to ambush German tanks from concealed positions, firing first and killing German tanks before they could react. They coordinated with artillery and tank destroyers, using combined arms tactics to overwhelm German armor through multiple simultaneous threats. The Sherman was not a good tank for one-on-one duels with German heavy armor. It was an excellent tank for combined arms warfare where infantry, artillery, air support, and multiple tanks attacked simultaneously. The 4th Armored fought the kind of war their equipment was designed for, not the kind of war German tanks were designed for. 4th Armored crews also modified their Shermans extensively, field modifications that were never officially authorized but were universally applied. Welding spare track links to the front and sides as improvised additional armor, mounting extra machine guns for anti-infantry work, adding sandbags on the hull, which were mostly ineffective but psychologically comforting, installing hedgerow cutters on the front, welded steel prongs that allowed Shermans to smash through the ancient earthen embankments that crisscrossed Normandy, improving waterproofing for river crossings, modifying stowage to carry more ammunition, more fuel, more personal gear. These modifications gave 4th Armored Shermans a distinctive, cluttered appearance. They looked improvised because they were improvised. General Wood encouraged this. He wanted tank commanders who understood their vehicles well enough to improve them, who did not wait for permission from higher headquarters to solve problems. The 4th Armored's maintenance culture, established during training, created an environment where crews could modify and maintain their vehicles in ways that enhanced combat effectiveness, even when those modifications violated regulations. The ammunition situation deserves special attention. Early Sherman 75mm guns fired armor-piercing rounds that could not reliably penetrate Panther frontal armor even at close range. This was a known problem, and it created understandable frustration among crews who found themselves in gun battles they could not win through frontal engagement. The solution arrived in late 1944 in the form of high-velocity armor-piercing rounds and the introduction of the Sherman 76mm variant, which had better penetration characteristics. But even before these improvements arrived, 4th Armored crews had developed tactics for dealing with superior German armor, shoot the tracks to immobilize them, then maneuver for side shots, use white phosphorus rounds to blind German tank commanders, forcing them to button up and lose situational awareness, call in artillery or air support rather than trying to win tank versus tank duels. These tactical adaptations reduce the importance of the Sherman's gun disadvantage. You do not need to penetrate frontal armor if you can get shots into the side or rear. You do not need to outgun the enemy if you can coordinate combined arms attacks that overwhelm their ability to respond. By late 1944, when the 4th Armored had been in combat for 6 months, their Shermans had evolved into something different from the factory standard vehicles they had received in England. They were battle-tested, field-modified, maintained by crews who understood every bolt and rivet, operated by commanders who knew exactly what the tanks could and could not do. These were not the best tanks in the war. They were good enough tanks operated by excellent crews with superior doctrine and overwhelming logistical support. The German Panthers and Tigers remained superior weapons in technical terms, but they were shackled to an army that could not keep them running, could not replace them when they were destroyed, could not train their crews adequately. The Sherman's secret advantages were not inherent to the design. They were inherent to the system that produced them, maintained them, crewed them, and employed them. The 4th Armored understood this. They did not need the best tanks. They needed tanks that worked, tactics that exploited their advantages, and logistics that kept them moving. Everything else was details. This understanding would carry them 1,200 miles across Europe, proving that in armored warfare, as in life, reliability and sustainability matter more than momentary superiority. August 12, 1944, somewhere in Brittany, France. Colonel Bruce Clark sits in the back of a moving half-track, surrounded by radio equipment. 3 separate radio sets crackle with traffic. He has a map spread across his knees, a grease pencil in one hand, a microphone in the other. He is commanding Combat Command A, approximately 2,500 men and 70 tanks, spread across 15 miles of French countryside. At this moment, he is coordinating 3 separate task forces attacking in different directions. Task Force Alpha is hitting a German roadblock from the south. Task Force Bravo is bypassing the same roadblock to the east, racing toward a bridge that must be captured before the Germans can destroy it. Task Force Charlie is establishing a blocking position to the north, cutting off German reinforcements. Clark is directing all 3 simultaneously, processing radio reports, making decisions, issuing orders, all while his half-track bounces along a dirt road at 20 miles per hour. The entire coordination takes 11 minutes. By the time his vehicle reaches the front line, all 3 task forces have achieved their objectives. The roadblock is destroyed. The bridge is captured intact. The German reinforcements are cut off and surrendering. Clark never stopped moving. This is the radio war, and it is changing everything. Compare this to how German armored commanders operated. General Major Heinrich von Luttwitz commanded the 2nd Panzer Division, a formation roughly equivalent to the 4th Armored in size and composition. When von Luttwitz needed to coordinate multiple units, he relied primarily on motorcycle couriers and telephone lines. Orders were written by hand, given to a courier who drove to the subordinate unit's command post, delivered the orders, waited for acknowledgement, then drove back with status reports. This process took hours. By the time orders reached frontline units, the tactical situation had often changed completely, making the orders obsolete. Von Luttwitz could not command on the move. He established static command posts connected by telephone wire to subordinate headquarters. When his division advanced, the command post had to be dismantled, moved forward, and re-established, during which time von Luttwitz was essentially blind and mute. Radio communications existed in German panzer divisions, but they were used sparingly, reserved for emergencies, limited by a doctrine that emphasized radio silence to prevent interception. The result was a command system built for deliberate set-piece operations, not for fluid, fast-moving battles where situations changed minute by minute. The 4th Armored's radio infrastructure was extraordinary by World War II standards. Every tank had an SCR-508 radio set that allowed the crew to communicate with other tanks and with higher headquarters. Range was approximately 20 miles under good conditions, less in rough terrain, but usually sufficient for the kinds of operations the 4th Armored conducted. The SCR-508 was a frequency-modulated set, relatively immune to the static and interference that plagued older amplitude-modulated radios. Each infantry squad had access to SCR-610 backpack radios that allowed dismounted troops to stay in contact with supporting tanks. Artillery forward observers rode in tanks or half-tracks with their own radio sets, linked directly to artillery battalions that could deliver fire support within minutes of a request. The division signal company had 450 men, 50% larger than standard divisional signal units, because General Wood had lobbied for additional communications personnel during the division's formation. He understood something that many commanders did not. In mobile warfare, communications were more important than armor or firepower. An army that could coordinate faster than the enemy could react would win regardless of equipment advantages. But having radios was not enough. The 4th Armored developed procedures and disciplines that turned radio equipment into decisive tactical advantage. First, they eliminated radio silence as a doctrine. Most armies in World War II emphasized maintaining radio silence except when absolutely necessary, fearing that radio transmissions would give away unit locations and intentions to enemy signals intelligence. The 4th Armored took the opposite approach. Transmit constantly, but coordinate so well that the enemy cannot react even when they know what you are doing. Clark and his fellow combat commanders transmitted continuously during operations, coordinating movements, redirecting units, calling for support, acknowledging reports. German signals intelligence could intercept these transmissions, but by the time they decoded the traffic and attempted to respond, the 4th Armored had already moved to new positions and begun new attacks. Speed of execution beat operational security every time. Second, the 4th Armored pushed radio communications down to the lowest possible level. In most American divisions, only battalion commanders and higher had reliable radio contact with supporting arms. Company commanders and platoon leaders had to route requests through battalion headquarters, creating delays and bottlenecks. The 4th Armored equipped every tank platoon leader with radios and trained them to coordinate directly with artillery and air support. A lieutenant commanding 5 tanks could call for an artillery barrage on his own authority without asking permission from higher headquarters. Forward observers attached to tank companies could request fire missions and have shells landing on target within 90 seconds. This was revolutionary. It meant that tactical opportunities could be exploited immediately, that threats could be neutralized before they developed into serious problems, that the tempo of operations was limited only by the speed at which tank commanders could process information and make decisions. It also required extensive training. Lieutenants had to understand artillery capabilities and limitations. They had to know which targets were appropriate for different types of fire support. They had to use proper radio procedures so their requests were clear and unambiguous. The 4th Armored spent months during training teaching junior officers how to coordinate combined arms attacks. By the time they reached France, it was second nature. Third, the 4th Armored developed a distinctive radio discipline that balanced speed with clarity. They used coded call signs that changed daily, protecting unit identifications without requiring lengthy authentication procedures. They spoke in clear, brief transmissions that conveyed maximum information in minimum time. Pastor 6, this is Able 7. Contact 150 yards. Engaging. Over. That transmission told the combat commander that one of his tank platoons had encountered enemy forces at 150 yards and was engaging them, and it took 4 seconds to transmit. Compare this to written orders, which would have required several minutes to compose and deliver. The 4th Armored's radio procedures were standardized across the entire division, so that any unit could coordinate with any other unit without confusion. Tank commanders from different battalions could work together seamlessly because they all used the same brevity codes, the same reporting formats, the same command structures. This interoperability became crucial during complex operations where task forces were assembled from mixed units that had never trained together. Artillery coordination through radio communications deserves special focus because it transformed 4th Armored tactics. Traditional artillery doctrine in World War II involved lengthy fire missions with multiple steps. Forward observers identified targets, called back to fire direction centers where officers calculated firing solutions, relayed those solutions to gun crews who loaded and fired, then waited for spotting rounds to fall so observers could adjust fire. This process took 15 to 20 minutes from initial target identification to effective fire on target. The 4th Armored reduced this to under 2 minutes. How? Forward observers rode in the lead tanks, watching through the same periscopes that tank commanders used. When they identified a target, they transmitted coordinates directly to artillery battalions using pre-calculated firing solutions for common engagement ranges. Artillery crews kept guns laid on predicted target areas, ready to fire on short notice. The result was that 4th Armored tank columns advanced with instant access to artillery support that could hit targets almost as quickly as the tanks themselves. German units reported being hit by artillery barrages that seemed to materialize from nowhere, striking within seconds of American tanks coming into view. This was not magic. It was radio coordination and pre-planning. Air support coordination showed similar improvements. Most American divisions in Normandy struggled to coordinate with Allied tactical air support. The process involved requesting air support through channels that went from division to corps to army to tactical air command, then back down through the air chain of command to the fighter-bomber squadrons that would execute the mission. This could take hours, by which time the target had moved or the tactical situation had changed. The 4th Armored established direct radio links with tactical air control parties who flew in liaison aircraft above the battlefield. Tank commanders could request airstrikes directly, describing targets using visual landmarks, and have fighter bombers overhead within 15 to 20 minutes. This was still slower than artillery, but it was fast enough to matter. German commanders reported that American armor seemed to have fighter bombers on call, ready to strike, anywhere at any time. The reality was less dramatic, but more impressive. The 4th Armored had built a communication system that integrated air and ground forces at a tactical level that other divisions had not achieved. The radio war extended beyond tactical coordination into operational intelligence. Because the 4th Armored transmitted constantly, their radio operators became intimately familiar with German communications patterns. They could not decrypt German radio traffic in real time, but they could recognize call signs, identify unit locations based on radio transmissions, track German unit movements by following which areas showed increased radio activity. Division intelligence officers maintained radio traffic analysis charts that showed where German units were located based purely on their radio emissions. This signal's intelligence was not as precise as decoded messages would have been, but it was fast and it was continuous. The 4th Armored often knew where German units were located hours before those units physically appeared, allowing them to avoid concentrations of enemy strength and exploit gaps in German defenses. German commanders, following their doctrine of radio silence, inadvertently made themselves blind to American signals intelligence, while the Americans, transmitting constantly, used German radio emissions to track enemy movements. But the radio war had limits. Equipment failed constantly under combat conditions. Radio sets were fragile, susceptible to moisture, shock, and electrical problems. Antennas were shot off tanks during firefights. Batteries died, tubes burned out. The 4th Armored Signal Company spent as much time repairing radios as installing them. Tank crews learned basic radio maintenance, replacing tubes, troubleshooting common problems, jury-rigging repairs using salvaged parts. Even with excellent maintenance, there were times when radio communications failed completely. Heavy terrain blocked signals. German jamming occasionally disrupted frequencies. In those moments, the 4th Armored reverted to older methods: visual signals, motorcycle couriers, prearranged plans that did not require continuous communication. The difference was that they reverted to these methods temporarily, as emergency backup, not as standard procedure. When radios came back online, coordination resumed at the same aggressive pace. The tactical advantage that radio communications provided cannot be overstated. It allowed the 4th Armored to operate dispersed forces in coordination, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously, concentrating combat power at decisive points without physically concentrating units. It allowed commanders to make decisions based on real-time information rather than hours-old reports. It allowed subordinate units to request support and receive it immediately rather than waiting for higher headquarters to recognize their needs. Most importantly, it allowed the 4th Armored to operate inside the German decision cycle. By the time German commanders received information, made decisions, and issued orders, the 4th Armored had already changed the tactical situation, forcing German commanders to react to situations that were already obsolete. This is what modern military theorists call tempo advantage, the ability to make decisions and execute operations faster than the enemy can respond. The 4th Armored achieved tempo advantage through technology, doctrine, and training. The radios were the technology. The willingness to transmit constantly was the doctrine. The ability to coordinate complex operations through brief radio transmissions was the training. Together, they created a division that fought at a pace German commanders found impossible to counter, not because the Germans lacked courage or skill, but because they lacked the communications infrastructure to react at the same speed. The radio war was invisible to observers watching tank battles, but it determined outcomes more surely than armor thickness or gun caliber ever could. August 15, 1944. Normandy, France. General Wood stands before a map in his command post, drawing lines with a grease pencil. He is about to do something that violates standard military doctrine: split his division into 3 separate forces attacking in different directions. Combat Command A will attack north toward the city of Alençon. Combat Command B will attack northeast toward Argentan. Combat Command Reserve will hold defensive positions around the town of Sées. The 3 combat commands will operate 30 to 40 miles apart from each other, essentially functioning as independent divisions for the next 72 hours. Wood's staff is nervous. If any of the combat commands encounters serious German resistance, the others will be too far away to provide immediate support. German commanders, seeing 3 separate American forces, might defeat them in detail, concentrating against each one individually. Wood listens to these concerns, nods, and issues the orders anyway. His logic is simple: the Germans do not have enough mobile reserves to stop 3 simultaneous attacks. If they concentrate against one, the other 2 will break through. If they divide their forces to face all 3, none will be strong enough to stop any. Speed and simultaneity beat concentration. Prove him wrong. Nobody can. The organizational structure that enabled this operational flexibility was unique to the 4th Armored Division, though other American armored divisions had similar frameworks on paper. The difference was that the 4th Armored actually used their organizational structure the way it was designed, while other divisions paid lip service to the concept while maintaining more traditional command arrangements. The division was built around 3 combat commands: Combat Command A, Combat Command B, and Combat Command Reserve, abbreviated as CCA, CCB, and CCR. Each combat command was essentially a self-contained combined arms team. A typical combat command might include 1 tank battalion with 54 Sherman tanks, 1 armored infantry battalion with 700 men in half-tracks, 1 artillery battalion with 18 self-propelled 105mm howitzers, 1 company of engineers, plus reconnaissance, medical, and supply elements. Total strength approximately 2,500 men. Each combat command had its own commander, typically a colonel, who exercised independent tactical authority within the boundaries of division objectives. Combat Command A was usually commanded by Colonel Bruce Clark, one of the most aggressive and capable armored commanders in the American Army. Clark was 42 years old in 1944, a West Point graduate who had spent his career in engineering and armor. He was known for personal reconnaissance, often leading scout parties himself to identify German positions before committing his combat command to attack. His command style emphasized speed and violence. When Clark's combat command hit German positions, they hit hard and kept moving, exploiting success rather than consolidating gains. Clark understood Wood's philosophy perfectly because Clark shared it: never give the enemy time to organize a defense. Combat Command B was typically commanded by Colonel Herbert Ernest, slightly more methodical than Clark, but equally aggressive when opportunities presented themselves. Ernest was 45, another West Point graduate, with a reputation for thorough planning. He preferred to know exactly what his combat command would face before attacking, but once committed, he pushed his units just as hard as Clark pushed his. Combat Command Reserve rotated through several commanders during the war, serving sometimes as division reserve, sometimes as a 3rd attacking force. The position was less prestigious than commanding CCA or CCB, but it was still a colonel's billet and still controlled significant combat power. The genius of the combat command structure was its flexibility. Wood could task organize each combat command for specific missions, attaching or detaching units based on what that mission required. If Combat Command A needed to capture a heavily defended town, Wood could reinforce it with additional tank battalions or artillery. If Combat Command B needed to conduct a rapid exploitation through open country, Wood could strip away its slower-moving elements and give it only fast tanks and mobile infantry. This task organization could be changed daily, sometimes hourly. A tank battalion might serve under Combat Command A on Monday, transfer to Combat Command B on Tuesday, and joined Combat Command Reserve on Wednesday. The infantry battalions, artillery battalions, engineer companies, all flowed between combat commands based on mission requirements. Standard operating procedures meant that units could integrate into new combat commands quickly without lengthy coordination or familiarization. Tank platoons knew how to work with any infantry company. Artillery battalions knew how to support any maneuver element. The training at Pine Camp, where combined arms teams were constantly formed and reformed, had prepared the 4th Armored for exactly this kind of operational flexibility. But the combat command structure enabled something more profound than just task organization. It enabled parallel operations, multiple simultaneous attacks that forced German commanders to make impossible choices. On August 15, 1944, when Wood split his division into 3 separate forces, German intelligence officers struggled to understand what they were facing. Radio intercepts suggested at least 3 American armored divisions operating in the sector. Prisoner interrogations revealed men from the 4th Armored Division, but those prisoners were captured at locations 50 miles apart. How could a single division be in 3 places simultaneously? The answer was that the 4th Armored was not operating as a single division. It was operating as 3 miniature divisions, each capable of independent action, each presenting a separate threat that required separate defensive measures. This multiplied the 4th Armored's effective combat power. The Germans could not ignore any of the 3 combat commands, so they had to divide their forces to face all 3, weakening themselves at every point of contact. The combat command structure also solved one of the fundamental problems of armored warfare: how to sustain high-tempo operations without exhausting your force. Traditional divisions operated as unified formations, meaning the entire division advanced together and rested together. When one part of the division became exhausted or suffered heavy casualties, the entire division's combat effectiveness declined. The 4th Armored could rotate combat commands through offensive and defensive operations. Combat Command A attacks for 3 days, while Combat Command B holds defensive positions, and Combat Command Reserve rests and refits. Then, Combat Command B takes over the attack, while Combat Command A defends and Combat Command Reserve rests. This rotation allowed the 4th Armored to maintain continuous offensive pressure without burning out any single element. There was always one combat command attacking, always one combat command available to exploit opportunities, always one combat command recovering from previous operations. German units facing the 4th Armored reported that American attacks never stopped, that every time they repulsed one assault, another came from a different direction. This was not because the 4th Armored had unlimited manpower. It was because they could rotate fresh units into combat while exhausted units recovered. The command relationships within the combat command structure were deliberately ambiguous, giving subordinate commanders maximum flexibility. Combat command commanders reported to General Wood, but they exercised independent tactical judgment within their assigned sectors. Wood gave them objectives, not methods. Take that town by sunset was a typical Wood order. Whether the combat commander took the town by frontal assault, envelopment, infiltration, or simply bypassing it and cutting off its garrison, that was the combat commander's decision. This required Wood to trust his subordinates completely. He could not micromanage 3 combat commands operating 30 miles apart. He had to select commanders who thought like he did, give them resources and objectives, then let them execute using their own judgment. This decentralized command structure was risky. If a combat commander made a bad decision, there might not be time to correct it before the consequences became severe, but the upside was immense. Combat commanders could exploit opportunities immediately without waiting for permission from higher headquarters. If Clark's scouts discovered an undefended bridge, Clark could seize it immediately, not send a request up to Wood and wait for approval. This speed of decision-making gave the 4th Armored an enormous tempo advantage over German formations, where every significant decision had to be approved by higher headquarters. The combat command structure required sophisticated logistics. Each combat command needed its own supply train, capable of moving with the combat command and delivering fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts wherever the combat command went. The 4th Armored's quartermaster and ordnance units were organized into separate support teams that mirrored the combat command structure. Combat Command A had its own fuel trucks, ammunition trailers, maintenance sections. Combat Command B had its own, Combat Command Reserve had its own. This allowed each combat command to operate semi-independently without competing for the same logistics assets. It also meant that when one combat command outran its supply lines, as frequently happened during rapid advances, the other combat commands could continue operating normally because they had separate logistics infrastructure. Traditional divisions had centralized logistics, meaning all units drew from the same supply dumps and competed for the same trucks. This created bottlenecks and delays. The 4th Armored's decentralized logistics meant that logistics moved at the same pace as combat operations, not as a separate, slower-moving function. Communication between combat commands was constant. Although they operated independently, they coordinated continuously through division headquarters. Clark, Ernest, and whoever commanded Combat Command Reserve maintained radio contact with Wood's headquarters, reporting positions, objectives achieved, obstacles encountered, intelligence gathered. Wood's intelligence section synthesized these reports into a comprehensive picture of the division's operations and the enemy situation. When one combat command identified a target that another combat command was better positioned to attack, Wood could redirect forces in real time. When one combat command encountered serious resistance and needed support, Wood could shift the division's main effort to a different axis of advance without stopping the entire division. This coordination was invisible to German observers, who saw only apparently independent American attacks that somehow always supported each other at critical moments. The reality was that the 4th Armored was conducting orchestrated operations, but the orchestration was flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances rather than following a rigid pre-planned sequence. The human dynamics of the combat command structure deserve attention. Commanders of combat commands A and B developed intense rivalries, competing to advance furthest, liberate the most towns, destroy the most German equipment. Wood encouraged this competition because it drove both commanders to take risks and exploit opportunities they might otherwise have hesitated to pursue. But the competition sometimes created problems. Combat commanders would occasionally exceed their assigned boundaries, advancing into sectors assigned to other units, creating coordination difficulties with adjacent divisions. Wood tolerated this as long as it produced results. His guidance to his combat commanders was simple. If you're moving forward and destroying Germans, you have my support. If you're making excuses, you'll be relieved. This created a command climate that rewarded aggression and punished caution. It also meant that the 4th Armored's combat commanders were under constant pressure to perform. Some thrived under this pressure, others broke. Wood relieved multiple officers during the war for what he considered inadequate aggression. These relief decisions were sometimes controversial, but they reinforced Wood's priorities: speed, violence, continuous offensive action. By September of 1944, after 2 months of continuous combat, the combat command structure had proven itself beyond any doubt. The 4th Armored had advanced further than any other American division while suffering moderate casualties because their organizational flexibility allowed them to avoid strong points, exploit weak points, and maintain offensive pressure without exhausting any single element. German after-action reports from this period repeatedly expressed confusion about 4th Armored operations. How could they be in multiple places simultaneously? How could they sustain attacks for days without pause? How could they coordinate so effectively across such wide frontages? The answers were all inherent in the combat command structure: decentralized command, task organization, parallel operations, logistics tailored to support independent operations, and a command climate that empowered subordinates to make decisions without waiting for higher headquarters. This organizational model would become standard in American armored forces after World War II, but in 1944, it was revolutionary. The 4th Armored was not just fighting differently than other divisions. They were organized differently, commanded differently, supplied differently. They were a three-headed dragon, and German commanders never figured out which head to strike, because by the time they focused on one, the other two had already moved to new positions and begun new attacks. This was not tactics. This was organizational design producing operational advantage, and it was about to carry them across France faster than anyone thought possible. July 28, 1944. 1100 hours, Normandy, France. The ground shakes, Not from artillery, though artillery is falling. The ground shakes from the weight of 2,000 American bombers that have just finished carpet bombing a 5-mile section of German defensive lines near Coutances. Smoke obscures everything. Craters 20 feet across pock the landscape. German strongpoints that existed 30 minutes ago are now smoking rubble. American infantry divisions are already advancing through the devastation, but they are not the main effort. Behind them, engines idling, sit the Shermans of the 4th Armored Division. They have been waiting in reserve for 6 weeks, training and preparing, while other divisions fought through Normandy's murderous hedgerow country. Now, the wait is over. Colonel Bruce Clark listens to reports on his radio. The German line is broken. Infantry is advancing. The road to Coutances is open. He keys his microphone and transmits one word to his combat command. Go. 2,500 men and 70 tanks surge forward. Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy, has begun. The 4th Armored is about to discover whether 3 years of training translate into combat success or catastrophic failure. The Normandy campaign before Cobra had been a nightmare of attritional warfare. American and British forces had landed on June 6th, but had failed to break out of the beachhead for nearly 2 months. The Norman bocage, ancient hedgerow country where every field was surrounded by earthen embankments topped with thick vegetation, favored defenders over attackers. German troops could hide in the hedgerows, ambush American patrols, and fall back to the next hedgerow position. American infantry divisions advanced by yards, measured in lives. By late July, the Allied armies had captured only a fraction of the territory they had planned to take by this point. Casualties were approaching levels that shocked commanders who had thought the landings would be the hardest part. The 1st Infantry Division, which had landed on Omaha Beach, had suffered over 6,000 casualties by late July. The 29th Infantry Division, which landed alongside them, had lost similar numbers. Something had to change. Operation Cobra. Was that change? A concentrated offensive that would smash through German lines using overwhelming force, then exploit the breakthrough with armored divisions that would race into the French interior before German reserves could seal the breach. The 4th Armored crossed the start line at Coutances on July 28th and immediately encountered their first reality of combat. Nothing goes according to plan. The roads were choked with vehicles from multiple divisions, all trying to advance through the same narrow corridors that the bombing had left passable. German resistance, though disorganized, had not been eliminated. Pockets of German troops emerged from bomb craters and fired Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets at passing American columns. The 1st 4th Armored Sherman knocked out in combat was hit at close range by a German anti-tank team that had hidden in a destroyed farmhouse, killing the driver and wounding the commander. The column halted. Inexperienced crews wondered if they should dismount and clear every building. Colonel Clark transmitted orders that would define 4th Armored tactics for the rest of the war. Bypass and report. Infantry will clear. Keep moving. The column rolled past the burning Sherman, past the farmhouse where Germans still hid, past every obstacle that was not directly blocking the road. Keep moving. Other units would deal with the bypassed Germans. The 4th Armored's mission was exploitation, not consolidation. By evening of July 28th, Combat Command A had advanced 15 miles. This does not sound impressive until you understand that some American divisions in Normandy had taken 2 weeks to advance 15 miles, losing thousands of men in the process. Clark's Combat Command had done it in 7 hours, suffering fewer than 30 casualties. They had bypassed dozens of German strongpoints, leaving isolated German units behind their lines, cutting off retreat routes for German forces that were still fighting against American infantry to the north. German commanders received reports of American tanks in their rear areas and did not believe them. How could American armor have penetrated so deep so quickly? The German 7th Army headquarters issued orders for counterattacks to restore the front line, not realizing that there was no longer a front line in any meaningful sense. The 4th Armored had not penetrated the line. They had driven through where the line used to be and were now operating in the German rear area, destroying supply dumps, overrunning headquarters, creating panic. July 29th brought the first major tank engagement. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, encountered a German armored column near the village of Coutances. Abrams was 30 years old, a West Point graduate who would eventually become Army Chief of Staff in the 1970s. But in July of 1944, he was a lieutenant colonel, learning how to fight his tank battalion against experienced German panzer troops. The engagement lasted 20 minutes. Abrams positioned his Shermans on a low ridge, overlooking the road where the German column was moving, achieving complete surprise. His tanks fired first, destroying the lead German vehicles and blocking the column. Artillery that Abrams had already coordinated plastered the stalled German vehicles. When German tanks tried to maneuver off the road, they bogged down in soft ground. Abrams' battalion destroyed 15 German tanks and armored vehicles without losing a single Sherman. This was not because American tanks were superior. This was because Abrams had used terrain, surprise, and coordinated firepower to create a situation where German technical advantages were irrelevant. The engagement lasted 20 minutes. Then Abrams' battalion continued advancing, leaving the wreckage behind. July 30th saw the 4th Armored advance 25 miles, a distance that seemed impossible in hedgerow country. How? They stopped fighting traditional battles. When Combat Command B encountered a German roadblock at Avranches, Colonel Ernest did not attack the roadblock frontally. He sent scouts to find alternate routes, discovered a secondary road that bypassed the German position, and led his entire combat command around the obstacle. The Germans at the roadblock reported American tanks approaching, prepared for battle, then watched American vehicles drive past on a parallel road 2 miles away. By the time German commanders realized what had happened and ordered the roadblock troops to pursue, Combat Command B was 10 miles further south, attacking a bridge over the Say River. This was Wood's doctrine in practice. Find them, fix them with minimal force, bypass them, forget them. Let follow-on infantry deal with isolated German positions. The armored Spearhead's job was to keep moving. The breakthrough into Brittany came on August 1st. The 4th Armored captured Avranches, a critical crossroads town, then poured through the breach. Brittany was open country compared to the Norman bocage, with fewer hedgerows and better roads. The 4th Armored's speed increased dramatically. August 2nd, advance 18 miles. August 3rd, advance 22 miles. August 4th, capture Rennes, the historic capital of Brittany. The German garrison evacuated hours before the 4th Armored arrived, abandoning supplies and equipment in their haste to escape. French resistance fighters reported that German troops were fleeing south, trying to reach the Atlantic coast ports where they could establish defensive positions. The 4th Armored pursued, not because they were ordered to pursue, but because pursuit was what they had trained to do. Exploit success. Never let the enemy establish a coherent defensive line. Keep moving until German resistance collapsed entirely. The casualties during Operation Cobra were surprisingly light for such aggressive operations. The 4th Armored lost 127 men killed in action, 448 wounded during the week-long offensive. These numbers were remarkably low compared to infantry divisions in the same sector. The 1st Infantry Division, attacking through hedgerows rather than exploiting breakthroughs, lost over 2,000 men during the same period. The lesson was clear. Offensive movement, despite its apparent riskiness, actually reduced casualties by preventing the kind of static, attritional fighting that characterized hedgerow warfare. German forces could not establish effective defensive positions if they were constantly retreating, constantly threatened from unexpected directions, constantly forced to abandon positions because American armor had cut their supply lines. The 4th Armored's aggressive doctrine was proving both tactically successful and surprisingly economical in terms of casualties. By August 5th, 7 days after crossing the start line, the 4th Armored sat 150 miles south of their starting point. They had captured or bypassed over 30 German strong points. They had destroyed hundreds of German vehicles. They had taken thousands of prisoners, though exact numbers were impossible to calculate because the 4th Armored rarely stopped to count. Prisoners were disarmed, pointed toward the rear, and told to walk back to American lines. Some did. Some escaped. The 4th Armored did not care. Their mission was not to process prisoners. Their mission was to destroy German combat power and keep advancing. German 7th Army headquarters, reading reports of American armor appearing in towns 50 miles behind German lines, initially assumed these were reconnaissance raids that would soon withdraw. They did not understand that the 4th Armored was not raiding. They were advancing. There would be no withdrawal. There would be no pause for consolidation. There would only be continuous forward movement until German resistance collapsed entirely or until the 4th Armored ran out of fuel. And since the 4th Armored was capturing German fuel depots as they advanced, they were not running out of fuel anytime soon. The morale boost from Operation Cobra was incalculable. The 4th Armored had entered combat expecting to validate or disprove 3 years of training. They had validated it comprehensively. Wood's aggressive doctrine worked. Clark's and Ernest's combat commands had performed exactly as designed. The Sherman tank, despite its limitations, proved adequate when employed correctly. The radio communication systems allowed coordination at speeds that German commanders could not match. The combined arms training paid dividends every time infantry, tanks, and artillery worked together seamlessly. Most importantly, the men discovered that they could do what their training had promised: move faster, hit harder, and lose fewer men than divisions using conventional tactics. Confidence surged through the division. Soldiers who had been nervous before their first combat now believed they were part of something special. They believed they could advance indefinitely, that no German position could stop them, that the war would be over by Christmas if everyone fought like the 4th Armored. That confidence would carry them through the next 8 months of combat, through battles that would test them in ways that Operation Cobra had not. But in early August of 1944, with Brittany falling and the German 7th Army disintegrating, the 4th Armored believed they were unstoppable. They were about to discover that unstoppable was not the same as invincible, but for now, they had every reason to believe in their own legend. August 8, 1944. Vannes, Brittany, France. A 4th Armored Sherman rolls into Vannes, a coastal town in southern Brittany, approximately 120 miles from where the division had started 10 days earlier. The tank commander expects to fight through German defenses. Instead, he finds French civilians celebrating in the streets, waving tricolor flags, offering wine and flowers to confused American tank crews. The German garrison evacuated during the night. No battle, no casualties, just another town liberated without firing a shot. The tank commander radios back to his battalion. Vannes captured, no enemy contact, continuing east. This scene repeats across Brittany and then across central France for the next 3 weeks. The 4th Armored advances so quickly that German garrisons retreat before engaging, hoping to establish defensive positions further east where they can make a stand. The problem is that the 4th Armored never gives them time to make that stand. By the time German units dig in at one position, American tanks have bypassed them and are attacking the next position. The pursuit becomes a race, not a battle. German troops are running, the 4th Armored is chasing, and every day the distance grows. The operational tempo during August defied everything that military planners thought possible. Military science taught that advancing armies needed time to consolidate gains, establish supply lines, rest exhausted troops, repair damaged equipment. The 4th Armored did none of these things. They advanced continuously, 24 hours a day, with lead elements moving forward while rear elements leapfrogged past them. A tank battalion would advance 20 miles, pause while another battalion passed through their position, then follow behind and advance another 20 miles the next day. This leapfrogging advance maintained momentum without exhausting any single unit. Combat commands rotated roles every 48 to 72 hours. Combat Command A would lead for 2 days, while Combat Command B provided flank security and Combat Command Reserve rested. Then, Combat Command B would take the lead, while Combat Command A moved to. Flank security and Combat Command Reserve took over positions that Combat Command A had been holding. The rotation meant that there was always a fresh Combat Command at the Spearhead, always a rested Combat Command ready to exploit unexpected opportunities. The pursuit revealed logistical creativity that later became textbook examples of improvised sustainment. The 4th Armored's official supply line stretched back to the Normandy beaches, over 100 miles by mid-August and growing longer daily. Supply trucks driving that distance required hours, sometimes days, to deliver fuel and ammunition to forward units. The 4th Armored solved this problem by capturing German supplies. Every town they liberated had German fuel dumps, ammunition storage, food warehouses. The 4th Armored's quartermaster units became experts at assessing captured materials for usability. German gasoline worked fine in American tank engines, though it had lower octane ratings. German diesel fuel powered American trucks. German ammunition in common calibers, mainly small arms ammunition, supplemented American supplies. The division even used captured German vehicles, trucks, motorcycles, staff cars, anything with working engines. By late August, approximately 20% of the 4th Armored's transport was captured German equipment. This violated regulations, but solved problems. Wood's response to criticism from higher headquarters was characteristically blunt. You can either give me supply trucks that can keep up with my advance, or you can accept that I'm using captured equipment. I will not slow down waiting for supplies. The speed of the advance created bizarre situations where French civilians did not realize they had been liberated. The 4th Armored would roll through a town at dawn, German troops would flee, and by noon the Americans would be 20 miles down the road. French resistance fighters would emerge from hiding in the afternoon, prepared to support the American attack, only to discover that the Americans had already left. In some towns, French citizens reported seeing American tanks drive through in the morning and German trucks retreating in the opposite direction in the afternoon, as if the war had simply passed through their community in different directions without stopping. Letters written by French civilians during this period expressed confusion and relief. Confusion about why the Americans did not stay to ensure the Germans could not return. Relief that their towns had been liberated without destructive battles that would have destroyed buildings and killed civilians. August 15th marked a critical decision point. The 4th Armored had cleared most of Brittany and sat at the city of Orleans, approximately 80 miles southwest of Paris. They had advanced 300 miles in 18 days. Patton, commanding 3rd Army and therefore the 4th Armored's higher headquarters, faced a choice: continue east toward Germany or turn north toward Paris and risk getting bogged down in urban warfare. Patton chose east. Paris would fall to other units. The 4th Armored would continue exploiting the German collapse, driving deep into France, cutting supply lines, preventing German armies from establishing coherent defensive positions. Wood agreed completely. Urban warfare would negate all of the 4th Armored's advantages. Their strength was mobile operations in open country, not fighting block by block through cities. Let infantry divisions take Paris. The 4th Armored would take everything else. The advance from Orleans to the Seine River covered 250 miles in 12 days, an average of over 20 miles per day through continuous combat operations. These statistics feel abstract until you consider what they meant for individual soldiers. Tank crews lived in their vehicles for days at a time, sleeping in shifts, eating cold rations, urinating into empty shell casings because there was no time to stop. Infantry rode on tank decks, clinging to handholds, dozing while the tanks rolled through the night, jerking awake when the column stopped or when they heard gunfire. Maintenance crews performed repairs while vehicles were still moving, mechanics hanging off the sides of half-tracks, replacing parts while their vehicles drove toward the next engagement. Medical personnel treated wounded soldiers in ambulances bouncing along dirt roads because there was no time to establish proper aid stations. The human cost of this operational tempo was exhaustion, stress, and psychological strain that would have broken less trained units. But the 4th Armored held together because their training had prepared them for exactly this kind of continuous operation. The German response to the 4th Armored's advance was chaotic. Wehrmacht units in western France found themselves cut off from supply lines and surrounded by French resistance fighters, who were increasingly active now that German control was collapsing. Some German units tried to retreat east, running directly into 4th Armored roadblocks. Others tried to establish defensive positions, only to be bypassed and surrounded. German 7th Army headquarters issued increasingly frantic orders calling for counterattacks to restore the front line, but these orders were ignored because the units that were supposed to execute them no longer existed as coherent formations. One captured German officer, interrogated in late August, provided a remarkably clear assessment. You cannot defend against an enemy who moves faster than you can organize a defense. We dig in at point A, and you attack point B. We shift forces to point B, and you attack point C. By the time we understand where your main effort is, you have already changed it. This is not warfare. This is pursuit of a fleeing army, and we are the ones fleeing. The liberation of French towns produced scenes of extraordinary emotion. French civilians who had lived under German occupation for 4 years emerged from their homes to greet American soldiers as liberators. Old men wept, women kissed tank commanders, children climbed on Shermans despite warnings that the armor was hot from running engines. 4th Armored soldiers, many of whom had never left the United States before shipping overseas, found themselves embraced by people who treated them as heroes. The experience was profound for young soldiers who had grown up during the Depression, enlisted for steady pay, and suddenly found themselves liberating a nation. Letters home from this period express wonder at the reception. The French people act like we saved their lives, which I guess we did. They want to give us everything: food, wine, flowers. One old lady tried to give me her father's war medals from the last war. I couldn't take them, but I didn't know how to explain that in French. By August 27th, the 4th Armored reached the Seine River at Troyes, having covered approximately 550 miles from their starting point at Coutances. They had been in continuous combat for 30 days. Casualties were remarkably light, approximately 800 men killed, wounded, or missing, less than 8% of the division's strength. They had destroyed or captured hundreds of German vehicles, killed or captured thousands of German soldiers, and liberated over 30 French towns and cities. More importantly, they had validated mobile warfare as a decisive operational approach. Military theorists would spend decades analyzing the August pursuit, trying to understand how one division could advance so far, so fast, while suffering such moderate casualties. The answers were all embedded in the 4th Armored's training, organization, and doctrine, but those answers would not become clear until later. In August of 1944, what was clear was that the 4th Armored had performed in combat exactly as General Wood had promised they would. They had moved faster and hit harder than any American division in history. The question now was whether they could sustain this performance, whether the physical and psychological strain of continuous operations would eventually break them, or whether they could keep advancing until German resistance collapsed entirely. The next test would come in September, at a place called Arracourt, where the 4th Armored would face not fleeing infantry, but concentrated German armor in the largest tank battle of the Western Front. August had been about pursuit. September would be about fighting. September 19th, 1944. Dawn. Near Arracourt, France. The fog is so thick that tank commanders cannot see 50 yards. Lieutenant Colonel Cratton Abrams stands in the turret of his Sherman, listening. He hears them before he sees them. The distinctive rumble of German tank engines, deeper and heavier than American Shermans. Panther tanks, probably a full battalion, advancing through the fog toward his position. Abrams keys his radio and transmits a single word: wait. His tank battalion sits on a low ridge overlooking open ground, invisible in the fog, guns loaded, engines idling quietly. The German Panthers advance blindly, following a road that runs directly across Abrams' front. The fog begins to lift slightly. Abrams can now see dark shapes moving, the angular silhouettes of Panthers emerging from the mist. He counts 20, 30, 40 tanks. His battalion has 34 operational Shermans. On paper, this is a battle the 4th Armored should lose. German Panthers outgun and outarm more American Shermans in every technical specification. But Abrams is not fighting on paper. He is fighting on terrain he has chosen, from positions the Germans do not know exist, with artillery already registered on the killing ground below his ridge. He waits until the German column is fully exposed, then transmits, fire. The Battle of Arracourt began on September 18, 1944, when the German 5th Panzer Army launched a major counteroffensive designed to drive the American 3rd Army back across the Moselle River and stabilize the German defensive line in eastern France. German High Command had assembled 262 tanks, including 86 of their formidable Panther medium tanks and several Tiger heavy tanks. This was the largest concentration of German armor on the Western Front since Normandy. Their objective was to hit the 4th Armored Division, which had advanced far ahead of other American units and appeared vulnerable to envelopment. German commanders believed they could destroy the 4th Armored in detail, then roll up the American flank and restore a coherent defensive line. The plan was sound. The intelligence was accurate. The the execution would prove catastrophic. The German attack on September 19th hit Combat Command A, which was holding defensive positions around the village of Arracourt while the rest of the division prepared for further offensive operations. Colonel Bruce Clark commanded the defense. He had approximately 100 operational Sherman tanks distributed across 3 battalion-sized positions on ridges overlooking the approaches to Arracourt. Clark understood that his Shermans could not win frontal duels with German Panthers. The Panther's 88mm gun could penetrate Sherman armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards, while Sherman's 75mm guns struggled to penetrate Panther frontal armor even at close range. But Clark also understood that tank battles were not decided purely by technical specifications. Terrain, visibility, surprise, artillery support, and crew training mattered as much as armor thickness. Clark positioned his tanks on reverse slopes, where they were invisible to approaching German armor, but could see German tanks silhouetted against the skyline. He coordinated with division artillery, ensuring that every approach route was pre-registered for immediate fire support. He instructed his tank commanders to wait for Germans to close to within 800 yards before engaging, maximizing the chance of penetrating side and rear armor. Most importantly, he told his men exactly what the plan was. Let the Germans come to us, kill them when they are exposed, do not advance to pursue. The initial German assault ran directly into Abrams's 37th Tank Battalion. The fog that morning was both curse and blessing. German Panthers could not see American positions, but American positions had been selected with clear fields of fire that became visible as the fog lifted. When Abrams gave the order to fire, 34 Shermans opened up simultaneously on the German column from positions the Germans did not know existed. The first German Panther exploded, blocking the road. The second Panther tried to reverse and was hit from the side by another Sherman. German tank commanders, trained to fight aggressively, attempted to maneuver off the road and charge the American positions. They bogged down in soft ground that Abrams had identified during his reconnaissance the previous day. American artillery, called by forward observers riding with the tank battalion, plastered the stalled German tanks with high explosive shells. The artillery did not penetrate German armor, but it killed tank commanders who were exposed in their turrets trying to identify American positions. It damaged optics and gun mechanisms. It created smoke and confusion. Within 20 minutes, 15 German Panthers were burning wrecks. The surviving German tanks withdrew, leaving their damaged vehicles behind. September 20th brought larger German attacks. The German 5th Panzer Army committed additional battalions, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. This was sound tactics. If the Americans were using terrain to ambush German advances, attack from so many directions that they cannot cover every approach. But the 4th Armored's organizational flexibility allowed Clark to shift his tank battalions rapidly to meet each new threat. A German attack from the north would be met by a tank battalion that had been holding the southern sector an hour earlier. German commanders reported American tanks appearing in unexpected positions, seemingly teleporting across the battlefield. The reality was that American tanks were moving at top speed between defensive positions, using radio communications to coordinate their movements, operating according to pre-planned contingencies that Clark had briefed the previous night. German commanders expected static defensive positions. Clark gave them mobile defense where American tanks refused to stay in one place long enough for German artillery to target them effectively. The fog on September 20th was even thicker than the previous day. German tanks advanced slowly, commanders navigating by compass, essentially blind. American forward observers, positioned in church steeples and other high ground around Arracourt, could see German tanks moving below the fog layer. They called artillery strikes onto German formations that could not see where the shells were coming from. One captured German tanker described the experience. "We heard American tank engines, but could not see them. We heard artillery shells landing all around us. Our commander was screaming orders, but nobody could see where to go. My tank was hit by something, maybe a tank shell, maybe artillery, I don't know. We bailed out and ran. I could hear German tanks exploding around me, but I could not see them. It was like fighting ghosts." The fog that should have protected German advances instead turned the battlefield into a killing ground, where American observation and artillery coordination made German armor vulnerable despite technical superiority. By September 25th, the German offensive had failed completely. German 5th Panzer Army had lost 281 tanks destroyed or damaged, including 71 Panthers knocked out. 4th Armored losses, 25 Shermans destroyed, fewer than 50 crew members killed. The kill ratio was more than 10-1 in the 4th Armored's favor. These numbers stunned German commanders who had expected their superior tanks to dominate the battlefield. A captured German after-action report, found in abandoned 5th Panzer Army headquarters, contained a brutally honest assessment. The American 4th Armored Division is the best armored division we have faced in this war. Their tanks are inferior to ours, but their tactics, coordination, and artillery support are superior. They do not fight the way we fight. They use terrain, artillery, and defensive positions to negate our technical advantages. Unless we can develop tactics to counter their approach, we cannot defeat them in armored combat. This report circulated through German high command and made the 4th Armored's reputation. From September onward, German intelligence officers tracked the 4th Armored's location constantly, warning frontline units when they were facing Wood's division. The Battle of Arracourt validated everything the 4th Armored had learned during training. Combined arms coordination between tanks and artillery proved decisive. Radio communications allowed rapid response to German attacks from unexpected directions. Terrain analysis and positioning negated German technical advantages. Crew training, which emphasized gunnery accuracy and rapid target engagement, gave American gunners the ability to hit German tanks on first shots at ranges where German crews expected to be safe. Abrams's battalion, which had started the battle with 34 operational Shermans and ended with 31, had destroyed over 40 German tanks, a testament to training and tactics' overwhelming equipment advantages. The battle also demonstrated that the Sherman tank, when employed correctly, could defeat German armor despite being outgunned and out-armored. The key was never fighting on German terms, never engaging in frontal duels where German advantages mattered, always using surprise, terrain, and combined arms to create situations where German tanks were vulnerable. The psychological impact of Arracourt extended beyond the immediate tactical victory. 4th Armored soldiers, who had spent months hearing about how superior German tanks were, now knew from experience that superior tanks did not guarantee victory. They had faced Panthers and Tigers and won decisively. This knowledge bred confidence that would carry them through future battles. Conversely, German tank crews who survived Arracourt carried stories back to their units about American tanks that seemed to be everywhere simultaneously, American artillery that could hit targets through fog, American commanders who somehow always knew where German attacks would come from. These stories bred caution, sometimes paralysis, in German units that would later face the 4th Armored. The psychological advantage was as important as the tactical victory. But Arracourt also revealed costs that statistics do not capture. The 25 Shermans destroyed meant 75 to 100 casualties. Crew members killed instantly when armor-piercing rounds penetrated their tanks. Crew members burned when gasoline engines ignited. Crew members who survived with injuries that would end their military service. Tank commanders who had led their crews for months died in seconds when German shells found their vehicles. Replacement crews arrived within days, trained but inexperienced, and had to learn combat realities that training could not teach. The 4th Armored's veteran corps was slowly being replaced by new soldiers who had not experienced the division's formation and early training. This process, inevitable in sustained combat, worried senior officers who understood that the division's effectiveness depended on institutional knowledge that was literally dying with every casualty. Wood addressed this in a message to his battalion commanders. Every man we lose takes knowledge with him. Every replacement brings enthusiasm but not experience. Train them fast. Use them carefully. We cannot afford to lose veterans carelessly. It was advice that acknowledged a reality. The 4th Armored could not sustain the casualty rates of conventional divisions because their effectiveness depended on trained crews and experienced leaders, not just numerical strength. September 29th marked the official end of the Battle of Arracourt. German 5th Panzer Army withdrew to defensive positions east of the Moselle River, abandoning their offensive objectives. The 4th Armored had held their ground, destroyed a German armored army, and preserved 3rd Army's flank. They had also established themselves as the premier American armored division in the European theater. Patton, visiting Clark's headquarters after the battle reportedly told Clark, "You just fought the greatest tank battle of the war, and nobody in America will ever hear about it." Patton was right. Arracourt never captured public imagination the way Bastogne would 2 months later. There were no surrounded paratroopers to rescue, no dramatic siege, no heartwarming story of relief arriving at the last moment. There was just professional, methodical destruction of German armor by American crews who were better trained, better coordinated, and better led. Military historians would later recognize Arracourt as the largest tank battle on the Western Front and one of the most lopsided victories in armored warfare history. But in September of 1944, it was just another battle, another validation of Fourth Armored Doctrine, another step on the road toward Germany. The division paused briefly to absorb replacements and repair damaged vehicles, then continued advancing. The war was not over. Arracourt had proven the 4th Armored could defend. The next test would prove whether they could sustain offensive operations through winter into Germany itself, against increasingly desperate German resistance. December 19th, 1944. 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Luxembourg. General George Patton stands before a map showing the German breakthrough in Belgium. 3 days ago, on December 16th, the German army launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, breaking through American defensive lines and driving west toward the Meuse River. An entire American Army Corps has been shattered. The 101st Airborne Division sits surrounded at a crossroads town called Bastogne, cut off from supply, running low on ammunition, vastly outnumbered. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, has called an emergency meeting. He needs Third Army to attack north immediately, to relieve Bastogne and blunt the German offensive. The problem is that Third Army is currently attacking east, toward Germany, turning 90 degrees north, reorganizing 3 full divisions, and attacking into the teeth of the strongest German offensive since Normandy would take most commanders 2 weeks. Eisenhower asks Patton how soon Third Army can attack. Patton, without hesitation, answers, December 22nd, 48 hours. The room goes silent. Officers present think Patton is joking or insane. Reorganizing divisions takes time. Planning attacks takes time. 48 hours is impossible. Patton turns to his operations officer. Call General Gaffey. Tell him the 4th Armored turns north immediately. They have one mission. Get to Bastogne. The situation at Bastogne was desperate, but not yet hopeless. The 101st Airborne, reinforced with tank destroyer battalions and artillery, had approximately 12,000 men surrounded by German forces estimated at 40,000 to 50,000. The Germans had demanded surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st, had responded with one word, nuts. Now the Germans were tightening the siege, bringing up artillery, preparing to overrun the American positions. Weather was brutally cold, temperatures dropping to -10 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow covered everything. Wounded soldiers in Bastogne cellars were dying from cold as much as from injuries. The 101st needed relief soon, or they would be overrun or starved into submission. Multiple American divisions were moving toward Bastogne from different directions, but they were fighting through German defensive positions, making progress measured in miles per day. None would reach Bastogne in time, except possibly the 4th Armored. General Hugh Gaffey had replaced Wood as division commander in early December, when Wood was hospitalized with pneumonia and then officially relieved for medical reasons. Gaffey was more diplomatic than Wood, better at managing relations with higher headquarters, but he shared Wood's aggressive philosophy. When he received Patton's order to turn north and relieve Bastogne, Gaffey was already moving. He had anticipated the order, had already begun reorganizing his combat commands, had already issued warning orders to battalion commanders. The 4th Armored sat approximately 100 miles south of Bastogne. The direct route ran through Luxembourg into southern Belgium, through German-held territory, over roads that were covered in snow and ice, through forests that favored defenders. Most commanders would have planned carefully, assembled overwhelming force, advanced methodically. Gaffey planned to advance immediately with whatever forces he could organize fastest, trusting that speed would compensate for incomplete preparation. December 22nd, the 4th Armored crossed the start line and drove north. Combat Command A, now commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Wendell Blanchard since Clark had been reassigned, took the lead. Combat Command B followed. Combat Command Reserve held positions to secure the division's flanks. The initial advance covered 20 miles against light German resistance, but everyone knew the real fighting would come closer to Bastogne, where German forces were concentrated. The weather was the immediate enemy. Temperatures remained below zero. Tank engines refused to start without extensive preheating. Road surfaces were sheets of ice that sent Sherman sliding into ditches. Infantry riding on tank decks suffered frostbite on their hands and faces, despite wearing every piece of clothing they owned. Medical officers reported that cold injuries were as numerous as combat wounds during the first 2 days of the advance. But the 4th Armored kept moving. They had trained in -20-degree weather in upstate New York 3 years earlier specifically for moments like this. Crews knew how to maintain engines in extreme cold. They knew how to prevent fuel lines from freezing. They knew how to operate when every exposed metal surface was cold enough to cause instant frostbite. Other divisions were stalling because of weather. The 4th Armored was not. December 23rd and 24th brought increasing German resistance. The 4th Armored was now within 40 miles of Bastogne, close enough that German commanders recognized the threat. They shifted forces to block the American advance, establishing roadblocks, mining approach routes, positioning anti-tank guns in villages along the 4th Armored's route. Combat Command A fought through 3 separate German defensive positions on December 23rd, losing 12 tanks and 50 men, but advancing 15 miles. Combat Command B, operating on parallel roads to the east, encountered similar resistance and made similar progress. The advance was costing casualties, but it was continuing. Other American divisions attacking toward Bastogne were making slower progress, sometimes advancing only 2 or 3 miles per day. The 4th Armored was still covering 10 to 15 miles daily, despite winter conditions and German resistance. They were going to reach Bastogne. The question was whether they would reach it in time. December 25th, Christmas Day. The 4th Armored spent Christmas attacking. Combat Command A reorganized into 3 task forces, each built around a specific objective. Task Force AB would attack the village of Tintange. Task Force Bravo would attack Hollange. Task Force Churchill would bypass both villages and drive straight for the village of Assenois, which sat on the direct route into Bastogne. This was classic 4th Armored doctrine, multiple simultaneous attacks that forced the Germans to divide their forces, with the main effort going where resistance was weakest. Task Force Churchill, commanded by Captain William Dwight, consisted of 1 medium tank company, 1 light tank company, 1 armored infantry company, some engineers, and a platoon of tank destroyers. Approximately 700 men and 25 tanks. Dwight's mission was simple: drive to Assenois, break through German defenses, and open a corridor into Bastogne. Speed mattered more than strength. If Dwight waited for reinforcements, the 101st Airborne might not survive another day. December 26th, 4:30 in the afternoon. Task Force Churchill approached Assenois from the south. The village sat on a low ridge overlooking the road into Bastogne. German troops occupied stone buildings that provided excellent defensive positions. Dwight could try to methodically clear the village, which would take hours and cost heavy casualties, or he could charge straight through and accept losses but maintain momentum. He chose the latter. His tanks formed a column and accelerated toward the village at top speed, 25 miles per hour, infantry clinging to tank decks, machine guns firing continuously at German positions. German anti-tank guns opened fire at close range. The lead Sherman exploded, blocking part of the road. The second Sherman pushed the wreck aside and kept moving. German infantry emerged from buildings with Panzerfausts. American infantry, riding on tank decks, shot them down before they could fire. The column crashed through the village in 10 minutes of chaos, losing 4 tanks and 20 men, but emerging on the north side with momentum intact. Ahead, 3 miles away, sat Bastogne. 4:50 in the afternoon, December 26th, 1944. A Sherman from Task Force Churchill crashes through the final German roadblock and enters Bastogne's perimeter. The tank commander, Lieutenant Charles Bogus, radios back to Dwight. "We're in." Inside Bastogne, soldiers of the 101st Airborne stare in disbelief at American tanks rolling through their defensive positions. Someone shouts, "Who are you guys?" Bogus climbs out of his tank and replies, "4th Armored Division, sorry we're late." A 101st paratrooper laughs and says, "You're not late. We weren't expecting anyone for a week." The siege of Bastogne is broken. The corridor is narrow, only 200 yards wide in places, vulnerable to German counterattacks, but it exists. 4th Armored supply trucks immediately begin rolling into Bastogne, carrying ammunition, medical supplies, food. The 101st Airborne has been saved. The relief of Bastogne became the defining moment of the 4th Armored Division's history, overshadowing even Arracourt or the pursuit across France. It captured public imagination in ways that technical victories could not. The story had everything: desperate defenders, impossible mission, Christmas drama, last-minute rescue. American newspapers published accounts under headlines like "4th Armored Saves Surrounded Paratroopers" and "Patton's Ghost Division Breaks Bastogne Siege." The 4th Armored became famous overnight, though their fame was paradoxical. Everyone had heard of Bastogne and the 101st Airborne. Fewer people remembered which division had actually broken the siege. The paratroopers at Bastogne became symbols of American determination. The 4th Armored remained relatively unknown, despite having performed the more difficult mission. This would become a pattern. The 4th Armored did the work that enabled others to become famous, but the 4th Armored themselves remained in the background, known primarily to military historians and veterans. The cost of the relief operation was significant, but not catastrophic. The 4th Armored lost 57 men killed, 130 wounded, and 19 tanks during the drive from Luxembourg to Bastogne. These were painful losses, but they were sustainable. More concerning was the exhaustion. The division had been in sustained combat since July, with brief pauses but no extended rest. Soldiers who had advanced across France in August were now fighting through Belgian winter in December. Physical exhaustion was evident: men falling asleep mid-conversation, truck drivers dozing at the wheel, officers making decisions while so tired they could barely think. Medical officers reported alarming increases in combat fatigue cases, soldiers who simply could not continue functioning despite having no physical injuries. The 4th Armored had proven they could reach Bastogne in time, but the relief operation raised questions about whether they could sustain this operational tempo indefinitely, or whether continuous operations since July would eventually break the division psychologically, if not physically. Patton visited the 4th Armored on December 27th, the day after the relief. He gathered officers and told them, "You have just completed one of the most remarkable operations in American military history. 100 miles through enemy territory in winter conditions, breaking a siege that everyone else thought was impossible to break in the time available. I chose you for this mission because I knew no other division could do it." Then he added something that veterans remembered decades later. "Now, rest for 24 hours. Then we continue attacking." There would be no extended rest, no rotation to rear areas, no pause to absorb replacements and retrain. The 4th Armored would fight through January, February, and March, attacking continuously, because Patton and Eisenhower believed the division was too valuable to take out of line. The relief of Bastogne proved the 4th Armored's capabilities. It also ensured they would never stop fighting until the war ended. Success bred more missions, more expectations, more pressure. The 4th Armored had become victims of their own excellence. They were so effective that higher headquarters could not afford to rest them. This would drive them forward through the next 4 months, through battles that would test them more severely than anything they had yet encountered, all the way into Czechoslovakia and the end of the war. But in December of 1944, standing in the snow at Bastogne, having just completed an impossible mission, they believed they could do anything. They were about to discover that anything had limits. January 15th, 1945, Alsace, France. Snow falls steadily on a 4th Armored column halted on a muddy road. Tank engines idle, burning precious fuel just to stay warm. Ahead, somewhere in the Vosges mountain foothills, German forces hold defensive positions in terrain that negates every advantage the 4th Armored normally exploits. No open ground for maneuver, no roads for rapid advance, just snow-covered forests where tanks bog down in mud and infantry has to attack on foot through knee-deep snow. A replacement soldier, arrived from the States 3 days ago, asks a veteran sergeant why they are not moving. The sergeant laughs without humor. "Welcome to Colmar. This is where fast divisions come to die slowly." The sergeant is exaggerating, but only slightly. The 4th Armored Division, built for mobile warfare, is about to spend 3 weeks fighting the kind of attritional battle that their entire doctrine was designed to avoid. It will be the hardest 3 weeks of their war, and it will raise questions about whether aggressive mobile warfare can work everywhere, or whether some battles simply require grinding through enemy defenses regardless of doctrine. The Colmar pocket was a German-held salient west of the Rhine River, approximately 850 square miles of territory that the German 19th Army had managed to hold, despite Allied advances on both sides. The pocket existed because German commanders recognized its strategic value. As long as they held Colmar, they controlled bridges across the Rhine and threatened the southern flank of Allied forces advancing into Germany. Eisenhower wanted the pocket eliminated before spring offensives began. The mission fell to French and American forces, including the 4th Armored Division. On paper, this was a straightforward assignment: attack German defensive positions, push them back across the Rhine, eliminate the salient. In practice, it would become a nightmare. The terrain was everything the 4th Armored's doctrine said to avoid. The Vosges Mountains, while not true alpine peaks, were heavily forested hills with steep slopes, narrow valleys, and road networks that channeled movement into predictable corridors easily defended by determined troops. Winter weather made everything worse. Temperatures remained below freezing continuously. Snow accumulated to depths that stopped vehicles and slowed infantry to exhaustion. Rivers were swollen with snowmelt, making fords impassable and bridges critical choke points. Sherman tanks, designed for operations in open country, were nearly useless in mountain forests. They could not maneuver off roads without bogging down. Their guns could not elevate sufficiently to engage targets on hillsides above them. Their thin armor was vulnerable to German infantry with Panzerfausts hiding in forests. The 4th Armored's advantages, speed, maneuver, radio coordination, combined arms integration, meant nothing when movement was restricted to single-file columns on icy mountain roads. The first attacks began on January 15th and accomplished almost nothing. Combat Command A advanced 3 miles in 2 days, losing 8 tanks and 120 men to German anti-tank guns positioned in villages that had to be cleared building by building. Combat Command B, attacking on a parallel axis, made similar progress at similar costs. This was the kind of fighting that infantry divisions had been conducting in Italy for over a year. Slow, methodical, casualty-intensive advances where every village was a fortress and every forest concealed German positions. The 4th Armored was not trained for this kind of warfare. Their strength was exploitation, not siege warfare. Yet here they were, attacking prepared defensive positions in terrain that nullified their mobility, suffering casualties at rates they had not experienced since entering combat. The psychological impact was immediate and severe. Soldiers who had advanced across France, who had broken the siege at Bastogne, who believed they were part of an unstoppable division, suddenly found themselves pinned down by German machine gun fire in forests where their tanks could not follow. Infantry squads that normally advanced with tank support were attacking on foot, wading through snow, being cut down by German fire from positions they could not see. Tank crews that normally operated with aggressive mobility sat in their vehicles on roads, unable to maneuver, waiting for engineers to clear mines or for infantry to secure hills overlooking the road. The waiting was harder than fighting. Crews who were used to constant movement sat idle for hours, exposed to German artillery that could hit stationary targets with precision. Morale plummeted. Medical officers began reporting increased cases of combat fatigue. Soldiers who refused to leave their foxholes, who claimed they could not continue, who showed no physical injuries but were psychologically unable to function. January 20th brought a temporary breakthrough. Combat Command B found a gap in German defenses and advanced 8 miles in a single day, momentarily reverting to the kind of mobile operations the 4th Armored excelled at. But the breakthrough could not be sustained. German reserves counterattacked, pushing Combat Command B back to their start positions. The 8-mile advance cost 80 casualties and accomplished nothing permanent. This was the reality of attritional warfare. Ground gained today could be lost tomorrow. Casualties were permanent, but territorial gains were temporary. The 4th Armored had spent 6 months proving that mobile warfare avoided attrition. Colmar was proving that some battles forced attrition regardless of doctrine. The casualties in Colmar exceeded anything the division had experienced in comparable timeframes. 348 men killed or wounded in 3 weeks. That was more than the division had lost during the month-long pursuit across France. It was more than they had lost at Arracourt. It approached the casualty rates that infantry divisions suffered routinely, rates that the 4th Armored's doctrine was specifically designed to avoid. The losses were concentrated in specific units: rifle companies that were attacking German positions repeatedly, tank platoons that were operating in exposed positions on mountain roads, reconnaissance units that were trying to find gaps in German defenses and instead finding German ambushes. Some companies lost 50% of their strength. Battalion commanders were requesting replacements faster than the replacement system could provide them. The division was bleeding. The replacements who arrived were poorly prepared for the conditions they encountered. Most had completed basic training in the United States, maybe some advanced training at replacement depots in Europe, but none had trained in winter mountain warfare. They arrived at frontline units wearing summer uniforms because winter clothing was in short supply. They did not know their squad mates. They did not understand 4th Armored tactics. They were thrown into combat situations where experienced soldiers were struggling to survive, expected to perform jobs they had not been trained for, in terrain nobody in the division had experience with. Some replacements performed admirably, learning quickly, adapting to the chaos. Others broke down within days, overwhelmed by circumstances that no amount of basic training had prepared them for. The veteran core of the division, soldiers who had been with the 4th Armored since Pine Camp in 1941, watched replacements arrive and die, and understood that the division they had built was being slowly transformed into something different. The institutional knowledge, the shared experience, the unspoken understanding that had made the 4th Armored effective was being diluted with every casualty and every replacement. By early February, the 4th Armored was withdrawn from the Colmar operation and given 2 weeks of rest. It was the first extended rest period since they had entered combat in July. 7 months of continuous operations without pause. The rest was desperately needed but insufficient. 2 weeks allowed time to absorb replacements, repair equipment, and catch up on sleep, but it did not address the deeper exhaustion that came from 7 months of sustained combat. Psychological casualties, soldiers diagnosed with combat fatigue and sent to rear area hospitals, numbered in the hundreds. These were not cowards or malingerers. These were soldiers who had fought through France, survived Bastogne, endured Colmar, and simply could not continue. Their nervous systems had been subjected to more stress than human beings were designed to handle. Medical officers recognized combat fatigue as a legitimate medical condition, but treatment options were limited. Some soldiers recovered after rest and returned to their units. Others did not, and were transferred to non-combat roles. A few never recovered psychologically and carried the scars for the rest of their lives. The Colmar operation, though tactically limited in scope, provided lessons that the 4th Armored would apply during the final months of the war. The primary lesson was humility. Mobile warfare doctrine worked brilliantly in appropriate terrain against disorganized opposition, but it was not a universal solution. Some situations required accepting attrition, grinding through enemy defenses, and suffering casualties that doctrine suggested could be avoided. The 4th Armored had spent 3 years, developing a doctrine based on speed and maneuver. Colmar proved that doctrine had limits. Recognizing those limits, understanding when to apply aggressive mobile tactics and when to fall back on conventional methods, became part of the division's institutional knowledge. It was knowledge purchased at high cost, but it made the division more effective in the varied terrain they would encounter during the final drive into Germany. The rest period in February also forced the division to confront uncomfortable questions about sustainability. The 4th Armored had been in combat for 7 months. The war would likely continue for several more months, possibly into summer or autumn of 1945. Could the division sustain operations for another 6 months? The casualty rates from Colmar suggested they could not. Something had to change. Either the division needed more extensive rest periods, or operational tempo needed to decrease, or missions needed to be selected more carefully to avoid situations like Colmar, where the 4th Armored's advantages were nullified. General Gaffey raised these concerns with Patton, arguing that the 4th Armored was being worn down by continuous employment without adequate recovery time. Patton acknowledged the concerns but could not act on them. The 4th Armored was too valuable. 3rd Army had no other division that could perform as effectively. Until the war ended, the 4th Armored would continue being assigned critical missions. Rest when possible, fight when necessary, hope the war ended before the division broke. It was not a satisfying answer, but it was the only answer available. February 15th marked the official end of the Colmar operation. The German 19th Army withdrew across the Rhine, eliminating the pocket. Allied forces consolidated control of the west bank of the Rhine River. The strategic objective had been achieved. The 4th Armored's role in achieving that objective had been significant but costly. They had proven they could fight in conditions that negated their advantages, but they had also proven that such fighting extracted costs that mobile warfare avoided. The lesson would shape operations during March and April as the 4th Armored crossed the Rhine and drove into Germany. Never again would they allow themselves to be committed to attritional battles where their mobility did not matter. They would insist on missions that exploited their strengths, and if that meant bypassing strong points, leaving them for infantry divisions to reduce, accepting criticism for avoiding hard fights, so be it. The 4th Armored had learned in Colmar that proving you can do something does not mean you should do it. Mobile warfare was not cowardice or avoidance. It was doctrine designed to win wars while minimizing casualties. Colmar had reminded them why that doctrine mattered. They would not forget the lesson. December 1st, 1944. Hospital, Luxembourg City, General. John Shirley Wood lies in a military hospital bed, connected to oxygen, running a fever of 102 degrees. Pneumonia, the doctors say, caused by exhaustion, stress, months of sleeping 3 to 4 hours per night, operating in brutal weather conditions, refusing to take care of himself because the division needed him. Patton visits and sits beside the bed. They talk about Bastogne, about the relief operation that Wood will not be able to command because he can barely breathe. Patton says something Wood has been expecting for weeks. "John, you've done enough. It's time to rest. You built the finest division in the Army. Now let someone else lead it for a while." Wood does not argue. He understands what Patton is really saying. You are being relieved, not temporarily, but permanently, because you have pushed yourself beyond sustainable limits, and you have pushed the Army's patience beyond sustainable limits. Wood closes his eyes and says, "The division doesn't need me anymore. That was always the point." He built a system that could function without him. Now he will discover whether that system survives his absence. Wood's relief from command was officially attributed to medical reasons, and the medical reasons were real. Pneumonia at age 54 could be fatal in 1944, before antibiotics were widely available. Wood genuinely needed rest and medical treatment, but the medical reasons provided convenient cover for deeper institutional tensions that had been building throughout the 4th Armored's combat operations. Wood had clashed repeatedly with 3rd Army staff officers over boundaries, coordination with adjacent divisions, and willingness to follow specific tactical instructions. Multiple times, Wood had exceeded his assigned operational boundaries, advancing into sectors assigned to other divisions, creating coordination problems that annoyed higher headquarters. When confronted, Wood's response was always the same. His mission was to destroy Germans and exploit opportunities, not to respect arbitrary boundary lines drawn on maps. If adjacent divisions could not keep up, that was their problem, not his. The tensions reflected fundamentally different philosophies about command and control. 3rd Army staff officers believed divisions should operate within assigned sectors, coordinate carefully with adjacent units, and follow operational plans that higher headquarters had developed. This approach emphasized predictability and coordination, reducing the risk of friendly fire incidents or gaps in the defensive line. Wood believed divisions should be given objectives and allowed to achieve those objectives using their own methods, even if that meant deviating from plans or exceeding boundaries. This approach emphasized initiative and exploitation of opportunities, accepting coordination risks in exchange for operational flexibility. Both philosophies had merit. The problem was that they were incompatible. 3rd Army staff wanted predictability. Wood delivered results, but not predictability. Something had to give. Wood's personality made conflicts inevitable. He was intellectually certain that his approach to armored warfare was correct, and he had 7 months of combat success to prove it. This certainty made him impatient with officers who questioned his methods or suggested alternative approaches. He could be condescending in meetings, dismissing concerns from staff officers who had not commanded troops in combat. He rarely attended social functions, preferring to work in his command post rather than build relationships with peers. He had no political skills and no interest in developing them. For Wood, war was a technical problem to be solved through analysis and execution, not a social endeavor requiring relationship management. This attitude worked as long as Wood delivered results. When results came with friction, higher headquarters began questioning whether Wood's effectiveness justified the coordination problems he created. The specific incident that sealed Wood's fate occurred in late November during operations in Lorraine. Wood's division advanced 15 miles beyond their assigned objective, capturing a bridge over the Saar River that was technically in another division's sector. The bridge capture was tactically valuable, preventing German forces from escaping across the river, but it also created problems. The adjacent division had been planning artillery strikes on that bridge, which would have killed 4th Armored soldiers if the strikes had gone forward. The 4th Armored's radio operators had not informed adjacent units that they were operating in their sector, creating confusion and near fratricide. 3rd Army Chief of Staff called Wood personally and ordered him to withdraw back to his assigned boundary. Wood refused, arguing that surrendering the bridge would allow Germans to escape. The Chief of Staff then ordered Wood to at least coordinate with the adjacent division. Wood said he would coordinate when he had time. The conversation ended with both officers frustrated. Patton, caught between his effective division commander and his angry staff officers, made a pragmatic decision. Wood had built the 4th Armored into the best division in 3rd Army, but Wood's health was failing, his conflicts with staff were increasing, and his usefulness was beginning to be outweighed by the friction he created. The pneumonia diagnosis provided an opportunity to resolve the situation without public controversy. Wood would be relieved for medical reasons, assigned to another division once he recovered, and replaced with a commander who could maintain the 4th Armored's effectiveness while managing relationships with higher headquarters more effectively. It was not a punishment. Wood would receive no negative fitness reports. But it was an ending. Wood had commanded the 4th Armored for 30 months, from activation through training through 7 months of combat. Now someone else would command them through the final 5 months of the war. Brigadier General Hugh Gaffey assumed command on December 8, 1944, 11 days before the Bastogne mission. Gaffey was 51 years old, a West Point graduate, an experienced staff officer who had served as Patton's chief of staff before taking division command. He shared Wood's commitment to aggressive armored warfare, but brought political sophistication that Wood lacked. Gaffey understood that division commanders needed to manage not just their divisions, but also their relationships with higher headquarters, adjacent units, and supporting elements. He attended the meetings that Wood had skipped. He coordinated carefully with adjacent divisions. He respected operational boundaries unless he had explicit permission to exceed them. 3rd Army staff officers noticed the difference immediately. The 4th Armored remained highly effective, but became easier to work with. This was exactly what Patton had wanted. The transition from Wood to Gaffey revealed something important about the 4th Armored Division. The source of their effectiveness was institutional, not individual. Wood had built systems, doctrine, and organizational culture that survived his departure. Gaffey commanded using slightly different methods, but the division continued operating according to principles Wood had established. Tank battalions still coordinated seamlessly with artillery. Combat commands still operated independently. Radio communications still enabled rapid response to tactical opportunities. Maintenance crews still kept operational readiness above 90%. The 4th Armored's effectiveness did not depend on Wood personally. It depended on the division Wood had built. This was both Wood's greatest success and his personal tragedy. His success meant he had created a division that would continue excelling without him. His tragedy was that the same army that benefited from his creation could not accommodate the man who created it. Wood's post-relief career was anticlimactic. He recovered from pneumonia, returned to duty in April 1945, and commanded the 79th Infantry Division during the final weeks of the war. The 79th was a capable division, but not an elite one. After years commanding armored forces, Wood found infantry command frustrating. Infantry divisions moved slower, relied less on maneuver, and required the kind of methodical planning that Wood found tedious. He performed adequately but without distinction. After the war, Wood retired as a major general, never receiving the third star that officers of his capability normally achieved. Army politics, which he had ignored during his career, ensured he would not be promoted beyond major general. He wrote occasional articles about armored warfare, corresponded with former 4th Armored officers, and died in 1966, largely forgotten except by veterans who remembered him as the man who had transformed them from uncertain recruits into the Army's finest division. The 4th Armored soldiers had mixed reactions to Wood's relief. Some were relieved, literally and figuratively. Wood had pushed them relentlessly, demanded perfection, accepted no excuses. His relief meant pressure might decrease, operational tempo might slow, life might become marginally less exhausting. Others were devastated. Wood had been the 4th Armored's identity, the commander who had shaped everything about how they fought. His relief felt like betrayal, like the Army was punishing success, like bureaucrats who had never seen combat were judging the man who had won battles they could not understand. This division reflected deeper tensions within the military. Should effective commanders be tolerated despite personality conflicts, or should all commanders meet institutional expectations regardless of their effectiveness? There were no easy answers. The Army chose institutional expectations. Wood paid the price. The 4th Armored continued fighting. In March 1945, Wood sent a letter to former 4th Armored officers, many of whom were still with the division. The letter was brief. "I built you to be independent. Now prove you don't need me. Continue the mission, win the war, come home safely. That's my last order to you." Veterans who received that letter kept it for decades. Some framed it, others carried it through the final months of combat. The letter represented Wood's understanding that his role had always been temporary, that his job was to build a division that would outlast his command. He had succeeded. The 4th Armored would fight with distinction through the final 5 months of the war, validating Wood's doctrine even as Wood himself commanded a different division, far from the glory he had helped create. It was an ending that satisfied no one, but perhaps represented the only possible outcome when individual brilliance collides with institutional requirements. Wood was right about armored warfare. The Army was right about command relationships. Both could be true simultaneously. The 4th Armored proved it by continuing to excel after Wood's departure, demonstrating that great divisions are built on systems and culture, not on individual commanders, no matter how brilliant those commanders might be. March 22, 1945, 1100 hours, Oppenheim, Germany. The Rhine River stretches 820 feet across, dark water moving at 4 to 5 miles per hour. German artillery shells explode in the water, sending up geysers 30 feet high. On the west bank, 4th Armored engineers are assembling pontoon bridge sections under fire, working with methodical precision while explosions bracket their positions. This is the last natural obstacle between Allied armies and the heart of Germany. For centuries, German military doctrine has treated the Rhine as the ultimate defensive barrier, the line that must be held at all costs. Hitler has ordered his troops to defend every foot of the western bank, to destroy every bridge, to turn the Rhine into an impassable moat. But 3rd Army has already crossed at Oppenheim, infantry divisions establishing a small bridgehead on the eastern bank during the night. Now the 4th Armored must cross on pontoon bridges while under fire, expand the bridgehead, and break out into Germany proper. It is a mission that combines engineering, courage, and the 4th Armored's signature aggression. Everything depends on whether engineers can build bridges faster than German artillery can destroy them. The strategic significance of the Rhine crossing cannot be overstated. Germany's entire defensive strategy in March 1945 depended on holding the Rhine line long enough to negotiate a separate peace with Western allies, or to develop miracle weapons that could turn the war around. Neither outcome was realistic, but German high command was operating on desperation rather than rational analysis. The Rhine represented Germany's last hope of establishing a coherent defensive line. Once Allied forces crossed in strength and broke out into the North German plain, German armies would be unable to prevent Allied advance to Berlin and beyond. The 4th Armored understood they were participating in a historic moment. Soldiers who had spent the war fighting through villages and forests were now crossing the river that separated Western Europe from Central Europe, the river that had been a frontier since Roman times. The bridgehead at Oppenheim was narrow and vulnerable when the 4th Armored began crossing on March 23rd. Infantry divisions held positions extending maybe 2 miles inland from the river, occupying German towns that had been captured during night assaults. German forces had retreated to defensive positions on high ground overlooking the bridgehead, from which they could direct artillery fire onto the crossing sites. The 4th Armored's Shermans could not return fire effectively because they were still on the western bank, or crossing on pontoon bridges where stopping to engage targets would block the bridge. Engineers building the bridges worked under constant fire, replacing damaged sections, repairing bridges that German shells partially destroyed, accepting casualties as part of the job. 17 engineers were killed or wounded during the first day of bridge construction. Their bodies were moved aside, and other engineers continued working. There was no time to stop. The bridges had to be completed before German forces could organize effective counterattacks against the bridgehead. The M2 treadway bridge that 4th Armored engineers constructed was a marvel of military engineering. 400 feet long, supported by pneumatic floats, capable of carrying Sherman tanks weighing 30 tons each. The bridge sections were prefabricated, transported to the riverbank on trucks, then assembled in the water by engineers working from boats. Under ideal conditions, experienced engineer units could assemble a treadway bridge in 6 to 8 hours. The 4th Armored engineers completed 2 bridges in 18 hours while under artillery fire, working through the night of March 23rd to 24th. The achievement required not just technical skill, but extraordinary courage. Engineers working in boats on the river were completely exposed to German fire. They could not take cover. They could not return fire. They could only work, trust that their comrades on the western bank were suppressing German positions, and hope that German gunners missed. Some did not miss, but the bridges were completed. By dawn on March 24th, the first 4th Armored Shermans were rolling across the completed pontoon bridges. The crossing was tense. Pontoon bridges swayed under the weight of 30-ton tanks. Drivers had to maintain precise speed. Too fast, and the bridge might break apart. Too slow, and they would become stationary targets for German artillery. Tank commanders stood in their turrets watching the eastern bank, expecting to see Panzerfausts or anti-tank guns at any moment. The first 20 tanks crossed without incident. Then German artillery found the range. Shells began landing on the bridge, in the water, alongside the bridge, on the eastern bank where Shermans were disembarking. One shell hit a Sherman directly, killing the crew and damaging the bridge. Engineers rushed onto the damaged section, working under fire to repair it, while the tank column backed up on the western bank. 30 minutes later, the bridge was repaired and the crossing resumed. By noon, Combat Command A was across the Rhine with 50 tanks. By evening, the entire division had crossed. The bridgehead fighting on March 24th and 25th tested whether the 4th Armored could execute defensive operations with the same skill they demonstrated in offensive operations. German forces counterattacked the bridgehead from multiple directions, attempting to drive American forces back into the river before they could consolidate. Combat Command A held a 2-mile deep perimeter, occupying towns and villages on the eastern bank. German infantry, supported by the few remaining tanks that German commanders could scrape together, attacked these positions repeatedly. The fighting was close range and brutal. Sherman tanks in defensive positions fought off German Panther and Panzer IV tanks at ranges of 500 yards or less. American artillery, still on the western bank, but within range of the bridgehead, fired continuous fire missions on German assembly areas. 4th Armored Infantry dug foxholes in German gardens and farm fields, establishing defensive positions that they held against German attacks that came every few hours around the clock. The defensive battle revealed capabilities that the 4th Armored had not previously demonstrated in combat. Their training had emphasized aggressive offensive operations, but Pine Camp in 1941 and 1942 had also included extensive defensive training. Now that training proved valuable, 4th Armored units established mutually supporting defensive positions, coordinated fields of fire, integrated obstacles with direct fire weapons, and executed all the defensive tactics that textbooks described. German commanders, expecting American armored units to be vulnerable in defensive situations, discovered that the 4th Armored defended as effectively as they attacked. A captured German major, interrogated on March 26th, provided a frank assessment. "We expected to push them back into the river. Instead, they stopped every attack we made. Their artillery was devastating. Their tanks were positioned perfectly. We lost 2 companies trying to take 1 village. It was not worth the cost." March 26th brought the operational breakthrough that transformed the bridgehead from a precarious toehold into a platform for offensive operations. German counterattacks diminished as German commanders recognized they could not eliminate the bridgehead. American reinforcements, infantry divisions, additional artillery, supply units, crossed the Rhine and expanded the bridgehead to the north and south. The 4th Armored, having held defensive positions for 72 hours, reverted to offensive operations. Combat Command BC, which had been in reserve during the defensive phase, attacked east toward Frankfurt. Combat Command A attacked northeast. Combat Command Reserve expanded the bridgehead to the south. The 3 combat commands advanced on divergent axes, exploiting the shock and confusion caused by the successful Rhine crossing. German units that had been expecting to contain a small bridgehead suddenly found American armor breaking out in multiple directions simultaneously. The breakout from the Rhine bridgehead resembled the breakout from Normandy 8 months earlier. German defensive coherence collapsed. Units retreated without orders. Some surrendered en masse rather than continuing hopeless resistance. American tank columns advanced 15, 20, sometimes 30 miles per day, moving so fast that supply trucks struggled to keep pace. The 4th Armored was back in their element, mobile warfare in open country against disorganized opposition. March 27th, advance 18 miles. March 28th, advance 25 miles. March 29th, capture the city of Wiesbaden. March 30th, reach the main river, 40 miles from the Rhine. The operational tempo was approaching what the 4th Armored had achieved during the August pursuit across France, with one critical difference. German resistance in March 1945 was collapsing faster than German resistance in August 1944. The Wehrmacht was disintegrating. The human experience of the Rhine crossing and breakout was complex. For soldiers who had fought since Normandy, crossing the Rhine felt like a symbolic milestone. They had advanced from the Atlantic coast of France to the heart of Germany in 9 months. The war had to be nearly over. Germany had lost the Rhine barrier, lost their last defensive line, lost any realistic hope of preventing Allied armies from overrunning the country. But for replacement soldiers who had joined the division in recent weeks, the Rhine crossing was just another operation, another battle, another day of fear and exhaustion. The replacement experience was distinctly different from the veteran experience. Veterans saw the Rhine crossing as the culmination of a campaign that began in Normandy. Replacements saw it as one more river crossing in a war that seemed to have no end. The logistical achievement of sustaining operations east of the Rhine deserves recognition. The 4th Armored was now operating 70, then 80, then 100 miles from the Rhine crossing sites where supply trucks had to cross. Fuel consumption increased dramatically as tank columns advanced at maximum speed. Ammunition expenditure increased as combat intensity varied unpredictably. 4th Armored supply units established forward supply dumps that moved daily, keeping pace with the division's advance. Quartermaster trucks made round trips from the Rhine to forward positions, delivering fuel and ammunition, then returning for more. The supply system worked because everyone involved understood that keeping the 4th Armored moving was the priority. If that meant truck drivers drove 20-hour shifts without rest, they drove 20-hour shifts. If that meant supply sergeants requisitioned supplies without proper paperwork, they requisitioned without paperwork. The bureaucracy adapted to operational necessity, just as it had during the August pursuit across France. By March 31st, the 4th Armored sat 50 miles east of the Rhine, having broken completely out of the bridgehead and returned to offensive operations that played to their strengths. The Rhine crossing had proven that the division could execute deliberate operations, engineering, defensive fighting, coordinated assaults, when circumstances required it. But the rapid exploitation that followed the crossing proved what everyone already knew. The 4th Armored excelled at mobile warfare, where speed and initiative mattered more than methodical preparation. The next phase of operations would take them deeper into Germany, through territory that was collapsing politically and militarily, where German resistance would range from fanatical to non-existent, where the 4th Armored would encounter not just military defeat, but the moral horror that German defeat revealed. The Rhine crossing was the end of one phase of the war. What came next would test the 4th Armored in ways that combat never had, forcing them to confront questions about what they had been fighting for and what victory actually meant. April 4th, 1945. Gotha, Germany. Combat Command. A enters the city of Gotha in central Germany, expecting street fighting. Instead, they find chaos. German soldiers walking down streets with their hands raised, trying to surrender. Civilians hanging white sheets from windows, signaling they will not resist. Gestapo headquarters burning, documents being destroyed by officers who fled hours ago. A 4th Armored lieutenant walks into the local Gestapo office and finds filing cabinets full of arrest records, execution orders, lists of names marked eliminated. The records document thousands of murders, political opponents, Jews, resistance fighters, people arrested for listening to foreign radio broadcasts. The lieutenant calls his company commander, who calls battalion, who calls division intelligence. Within hours, 4th Armored intelligence officers are photographing documents, compiling evidence, beginning to understand the bureaucratic machinery of genocide. This is not combat. This is discovery. The 4th Armored has been fighting the German military for 9 months. Now they are discovering what that military was defending. The advance through Thuringia in early April was militarily anticlimactic. German resistance ranged from sporadic to non-existent. Entire Wehrmacht units surrendered without fighting, sometimes marching down roads toward American lines carrying white flags. German officers, understanding the war was lost, were trying to surrender to American or British forces rather than Soviet forces advancing from the east. They had heard stories about Soviet treatment of prisoners and preferred Western captivity. The 4th Armored found itself processing thousands of prisoners daily, far more than they could handle with organic assets. Prisoners were disarmed, searched for intelligence material, pointed toward rear areas, and told to walk to prisoner of war collection points. Some did. Some escaped into the German countryside and went home. The 4th Armored did not have the personnel to guard prisoners properly, and by April 1945 they did not particularly care. The war was ending. German soldiers walking away were not going to rejoin the fight. Let them go. April 12, 1945, brought the discovery that would define the 4th Armored's legacy as completely as any combat action. Ohrdruf concentration camp, a subcamp of Buchenwald, approximately 40 miles from Gotha. Forward reconnaissance patrols reported finding a camp full of dead bodies and a handful of survivors barely alive. Combat Command. A diverted tanks to investigate. What they found defied comprehension. Approximately 4,000 bodies, some buried in shallow mass graves, others lying in the open where they had died. Survivors who weighed 70 or 80 pounds, skeletal, barely able to walk. Evidence of systematic murder, execution, pits, crematory furnaces, gas chambers. SS guards had fled days earlier, killing as many prisoners as possible before evacuating. The survivors who remained told stories of forced labor, starvation, torture, medical experiments, arbitrary executions. 4th Armored soldiers, hardened by 9 months of combat, stood in Ohrdruf and wept. They had thought they were fighting a conventional war against a conventional enemy. Now they understood they had been fighting something darker. General Eisenhower visited Ohrdruf on April 12th, brought there by Patton and Omar Bradley. Eisenhower walked through the camp, looked at the bodies, spoke with survivors through interpreters. He ordered that every nearby German town's population be forced to walk through Ohrdruf to see what had been done in their name. He ordered photographers to document everything, understanding that people would later claim these atrocities had been exaggerated or fabricated. He ordered frontline units to preserve any camps they discovered as evidence for future war crimes trials. Patton, normally iron-willed, vomited after touring Ohrdruf. Bradley, usually composed, looked physically ill. The 3 most senior American commanders in Europe stood in Ohrdruf and understood that the war they had been fighting was more important than they had realized. This was not about territory or politics. This was about stopping evil. The discovery gave retroactive meaning to every battle, every casualty, every sacrifice. The 4th Armored had not just been liberating France and defeating Germany, they had been preventing this from continuing. The soldiers who discovered Ordruf carried what they saw for the rest of their lives. Veterans interviewed decades later could describe Ordruf in detail: the smell, the bodies, the survivors' faces, the realization of what they had discovered. Some soldiers took photographs, though photography was technically prohibited. These photographs eventually found their way to newspapers and history books, providing visual evidence of the Holocaust. Other soldiers could not bring themselves to photograph what they saw, feeling that making images of such horror was somehow disrespectful to the victims. Many soldiers wrote letters home describing Ohrdruf, trying to explain to families what they had found, struggling to put the experience into words. Censors initially blocked these letters, worried that descriptions of concentration camps were too horrible to be believed and might be dismissed as propaganda. Eventually, the censorship was lifted. The world needed to know. The moral impact of Ohrdruf transformed how 4th Armored soldiers understood their war. Before Ohrdruf, the war had been a job, dangerous, exhausting, occasionally exhilarating, but fundamentally a military task to be completed. After Ohrdruf, the war had meaning that transcended tactics and operations. Soldiers who had been questioning why they were fighting, whether the war was worth the cost, whether they could morally continue killing German soldiers, found their answers in Ohrdruf. Every German soldier they had killed, every German position they had destroyed, every mile they had advanced, had contributed to stopping the horror they discovered in that camp. The 4th Armored had lost over 1,000 men killed since entering combat. Those deaths had prevented Ohrdruf from continuing. The math was simple and terrible, and gave purpose to everything they had done. April 15th brought the liberation of Buchenwald main camp, larger than Ohrdruf, containing approximately 20,000 survivors. The 4th Armored secured the perimeter while infantry divisions processed prisoners and began providing medical care. Conditions at Buchenwald were similar to Ohrdruf, but on a larger scale. More bodies, more survivors, more evidence of systematic murder. Eisenhower's order that German civilians be forced to witness the camps was implemented at Buchenwald. Residents of Weimar, a city of 60,000 approximately 6 miles from Buchenwald, were marched through the camp in groups. Some claimed they had not known about the camp despite living 6 miles away. Some wept. Some looked away. American soldiers forced them to look, forced them to confront what had been happening in their vicinity. The process was harsh, but felt necessary. These civilians had supported or at least tolerated the Nazi regime. Now they would see what that regime had created. The operational tempo of the advance continued, despite the moral shock of the camp discoveries. Combat Command B advanced 150 miles in 5 days between April 15th and April 20th, racing across Thuringia toward Bavaria. German resistance collapsed almost entirely. Whole towns surrendered without fighting. German military units were disintegrating, soldiers abandoning their posts and trying to reach home before Soviet forces arrived from the east. The 4th Armored captured approximately 40,000 German prisoners during April, more than they had captured during the previous 9 months combined. The prisoner processing overwhelmed 4th Armored capabilities. Eventually, they simply established prisoner of war cages, put German officers in charge of their own men, provided minimal food and water, and left them for follow-on units to process properly. It was an expedient solution to an impossible problem. The psychological state of 4th Armored soldiers in mid-April was complex. They were exhausted after 10 months of combat. They were traumatized by what they had discovered in the concentration camps. They were exhilarated by the obvious collapse of German resistance. They were anxious about whether the war would end before they were killed or wounded. Casualties continued despite reduced German resistance. Snipers shot at American columns from buildings. Scattered German units that had not surrendered fought briefly before being overrun. Landmines planted. Weeks earlier still killed soldiers. The war was ending, but it had not ended yet, and soldiers who had survived 10 months did not want to die in the final weeks. Medical officers reported that combat fatigue cases were increasing despite decreasing combat's intensity. Soldiers who had held themselves together through Normandy, Bastogne, and the Rhine crossing were finally breaking down now that the end was visible. The psychological resources required to sustain combat performance for 10 months were depleting. Some men would make it to the end of the war psychologically intact. Others would not. April 20th, 1945, was Adolf Hitler's birthday. The 4th Armored spent it capturing German towns in Bavaria and processing surrendering German soldiers. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. The regime that had started the war, that had killed 60 million people, that had built concentration camps, was collapsing on its leader's birthday. Soldiers joked darkly about the appropriate birthday present: complete military defeat and exposure of genocide. The jokes were gallows humor, a way of processing horrors that could not be processed seriously without psychological breakdown. Humor, even dark humor, was a survival mechanism. Soldiers who could still joke were soldiers who had not yet broken. The jokes continued through April, even as discoveries of additional camps, additional atrocities, additional evidence of systematic murder accumulated. The 4th Armored found their way through horror by compartmentalizing: discover atrocities, document them, report them, then continue advancing. Do not dwell on what you have seen. Do not try to process it emotionally. Just keep moving. The mission continues until it ends. Process the trauma later, if later ever comes. By April 30th, the 4th Armored had advanced deep into Bavaria, approaching the Austrian border. They had traveled approximately 1,200 miles from the Normandy beaches to southern Germany in 10 months. They had liberated dozens of concentration camps and subcamps. They had captured over 100,000 German soldiers. They had destroyed or captured thousands of German vehicles. They had lost approximately 1,300 men killed and 3,000 wounded. The casualties were moderate by World War II standards, but devastating in human terms. 1,300 families receiving telegrams. 3,000 soldiers carrying wounds, physical and psychological, that would last lifetimes. The 4th Armored had accomplished everything asked of them, and more. They had proven mobile warfare doctrine. They had validated aggressive leadership. They had demonstrated that well-trained combined arms divisions could achieve decisive results. But they had also discovered that wars are fought for purposes beyond military victory. The concentration camps gave meaning to the campaign. Without that meaning, the war might have seemed like pointless violence. With that meaning, every sacrifice made sense. The 4th Armored had not just defeated Germany, they had stopped evil. Understanding that difference would shape how veterans remembered the war for the rest of their lives. May 4th, 1945, Czech border, near Volary. A 4th Armored Sherman crosses into Czechoslovakia, the first American tank to enter Czech territory in this sector. Czech civilians line the road, waving flags, throwing flowers, weeping with relief. The tank commander, Sergeant James O'Neill, stands in his turret and waves back, unsure what else to do. His tank has fought from Normandy through France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, and now Czechoslovakia. He has been in combat for 10 months. He knows the war is ending. German resistance has collapsed. Hitler is reportedly dead. Surrender negotiations are underway. But his orders are to continue advancing east until meeting Soviet forces or receiving stop orders. The problem is that stop orders have not arrived, and Soviet forces are somewhere ahead, also advancing, and nobody has clearly defined where American and Soviet zones of occupation meet. O'Neill's mission is simple and impossible. Advance until someone tells you to stop, but do not accidentally start World War III by shooting at Soviet troops. He orders his driver forward. They will advance until something stops them, and they will hope that something is orders, not Soviet tanks. The strategic situation in early May was chaotic. Germany had effectively ceased to exist as a functioning state. Hitler had committed suicide on April 30th. Remnants of German government were attempting to negotiate surrender to Western allies while continuing to fight Soviet forces in the east. Allied High Command wanted to accept only unconditional surrender on all fronts simultaneously, not separate surrenders to Western and Soviet forces. Negotiations continued while fighting continued. The 4th Armored, operating in southern Germany and western Czechoslovakia, found themselves in a strategic gray zone. Their assigned mission was to advance east and link up with Soviet forces, establishing a clear demarcation between American and Soviet zones of occupation. But the exact location of that demarcation had not been finalized in negotiations between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. The Yalta Conference in February had established general boundaries, but specific details remained unclear. The 4th Armored was advancing into territory where political decisions were still being made. The advance into Czechoslovakia was rapid and largely unopposed. Czech resistance fighters had been harassing German occupation forces for years, and with German collapse they emerged from hiding and took control of many towns before American forces arrived. 4th Armored columns rolled through villages that were already free, greeted by Czech civilians who treated them as liberators, despite the Americans having arrived after the liberation was already complete. The reception was emotional and genuine. Czechoslovakia had been occupied by Germany since 1938, over 6 years of occupation that had been harsh and exploitative. Czech citizens had been conscripted for forced labor. Their industries had been converted to German war production. Their political leaders had been imprisoned or executed. Now they were free, and American tanks represented that freedom, even if German forces had already fled or surrendered. May 5th brought the 4th Armored to Villari, approximately 60 miles inside Czechoslovakia, roughly 100 miles from Prague. Prague was the Czech capital and the strategic prize. Czech resistance forces had risen in rebellion in Prague on May 5th, attacking German garrison forces, attempting to liberate the city before either American or Soviet forces arrived. Radio broadcasts from Prague called for Allied assistance, but Allied High Command had already decided that Prague would be in the Soviet occupation zone. American forces would halt west of Prague. Soviet forces would liberate the capital. This political decision created a military absurdity. American forces capable of reaching Prague in 12 to 18 hours were ordered to halt, while Soviet forces, still days away, advanced toward the city. Czech civilians in Prague were fighting and dying, while American tanks sat idle 60 miles away. The 4th Armored's officers and soldiers reacted to the stop order with frustration and incomprehension. They had spent 10 months advancing toward Germany. They had never stopped when capable of continuing. Now, with victory within reach, with German resistance collapsed, with Czech civilians literally calling for help, they were ordered to halt. The official explanation was that Prague was in the Soviet zone according to agreements made at Yalta. The unofficial reality was that Allied leadership feared triggering conflict with Soviet forces if American and Soviet troops met in confused circumstances around Prague. Better to establish clear boundaries, halt American advances, allow Soviet forces to complete their operations, then meet under controlled conditions at predetermined locations. This was sound strategic thinking that made perfect sense at the level of grand strategy. At the tactical level, to soldiers who had fought for 10 months, it felt like abandonment. Some 4th Armored units exceeded their stop orders, advancing several miles beyond Villari before being recalled. These advances were technically insubordination, but reflected the division's institutional culture. When in doubt, advance. Officers who exceeded boundaries were reprimanded but not relieved, because everyone understood that their instinct to continue advancing was the same instinct that had made the 4th Armored successful throughout the campaign. The reprimands were formalities, delivered without heat, accepted without protest. The war was ending. Discipline was maintained, but it was enforced lightly. Soldiers who had spent 10 months following orders perfectly had earned the right to a few minor infractions in the war's final days. May 7, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally to all Allied forces, effective May 8th at midnight. The announcement reached the 4th Armored via radio, transmitted from division headquarters to combat commands to battalions to companies. Reactions were surprisingly muted. Some soldiers cheered, others sat quietly, processing the information. Many felt relief more than joy. The war was over. They had survived. They would not die in combat. They would eventually go home. These realizations took time to process. After 10 months of combat, where every day brought a possibility of death or injury, the sudden absence of that threat felt disorienting. Soldiers who had defined themselves by their combat mission for 10 months now had to redefine themselves in peacetime. The transition would not be easy. The 4th Armored sat in Villari, Czechoslovakia, for 3 days after the surrender, waiting for orders. Soviet forces reached Prague on May 9th, completing the liberation that Czech resistance had begun. American and Soviet forces established contact at multiple points along the agreed boundary line. Commanders met, exchanged formal greetings, coordinated procedures for managing refugees and displaced persons, and maintained careful protocol to avoid incidents. Relations between American and Soviet forces in May 1945 were correct but not warm. Both sides recognized they had been allies of convenience, united by common enemy Germany, but likely to be rivals in the post-war world. The civility was maintained, but underlying tensions were obvious. The 4th Armored soldiers, meeting Soviet troops for the first time, were struck by differences in equipment, training, and operational methods. Soviet forces had suffered casualties that dwarfed American losses. Soviet tactics emphasized mass and shock over finesse. Soviet soldiers looked battle-hardened and exhausted in ways that made even veteran American soldiers uncomfortable. The question of what might have happened if the 4th Armored had been allowed to reach Prague remains one of the great counterfactuals of World War II. If American forces had liberated Prague in early May, would Czechoslovakia have fallen into the Soviet sphere of influence in 1948? Would the Cold War have developed differently? These questions are unanswerable, but they haunted some 4th Armored veterans for decades. They had reached within hours of Prague, capable of liberating the city, and had been ordered to halt for political reasons they could not influence. Czech civilians who lived through Soviet occupation sometimes expressed regret that American forces had not reached Prague first. But historical might-have-beens provide no comfort. The 4th Armored halted where ordered. Soviet forces liberated Prague. Czechoslovakia became a Soviet satellite state after the war. These were facts that could not be changed by later regrets. May 8th VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, was anticlimactic for the 4th Armored. They were sitting in Czech villages, maintaining defensive positions despite there being no enemy to defend against, processing surrendering German soldiers who were trying to reach American lines before being captured by Soviet forces. The celebrations that occurred in London, Paris, and New York had no equivalent in Villeray. Soldiers understood the war was over, but the relief was personal and internal, not something that required public celebration. Some units organized small parties, breaking out captured German alcohol, singing songs, making toasts to absent comrades who had died during the campaign. Other units simply slept, taking advantage of the first opportunity in 10 months to sleep without fear of night attacks or early morning missions. The final position that the 4th Armored held on VE Day represented their journey, 1,260 miles from Coutances, France, to Volary, Czechoslovakia. 280 days of combat, 74 towns liberated, over 140,000 enemy soldiers killed or captured, 1,342 4th Armored soldiers killed in action, 3,141 wounded. These statistics summarize 10 months of history, but could not capture the experience. The miles represented days spent in tank turrets, nights spent sleeping on the ground, hours spent under fire, moments spent watching friends die. The towns represented civilians liberated, resistance fighters embraced, children fed from American rations. The enemy casualties represented individual combats, tank battles, artillery barrages. Every engagement multiplied hundreds of times. The American casualties represented families destroyed, lives ended, futures lost. Statistics quantified reality but could not explain it. The 4th Armored had fought the war as well as any division could fight it. They had validated mobile warfare doctrine. They had proven that speed, initiative, and combined arms coordination could achieve decisive results. They had demonstrated that American soldiers, properly trained and led, could defeat the German Wehrmacht on any battlefield, but proving these things had required paying a price. 1,300 men would not return home. 3,000 would return with wounds. Everyone would return changed. The question now was whether the price had been worth paying. The answer would depend on what came next. May 10th, 1945. Bavaria, Germany. A 4th Armored sergeant stands in a German town square, directing traffic. German civilians walk past carrying belongings, trying to return to homes they evacuated during the fighting. Displaced persons, former concentration camp prisoners, slave laborers, refugees from Eastern Europe, Shuffle toward assembly points where Allied authorities are attempting to organize repatriation. Wehrmacht soldiers, now prisoners of war, sit in a fenced field awaiting processing. The sergeant, who 3 days ago was fighting through German defenses, is now managing civilian movement, resolving disputes about property ownership, and trying to maintain order with limited German language skills and no police training. He is a warrior being asked to perform law enforcement, and he is not particularly good at it. But someone has to manage the chaos, and the 4th Armored is here, so the 4th Armored does the job. Welcome to occupation duty. The transition from combat to occupation happened with shocking rapidity. On May 7th, the 4th Armored was preparing for combat operations. On May 8th, the war ended. On May 9th, the division received orders to establish occupation zones in Bavaria and western Czechoslovakia, maintaining civil order, preventing revenge attacks, managing displaced persons, and beginning the process of demilitarizing Germany. These missions required skills that combat soldiers did not possess and had not trained for. Infantry riflemen became police officers. Tank crews became traffic control points. Artillery units became civil affairs administrators. The transformation was awkward and incomplete, but it was necessary. Germany had ceased functioning as a state. Allied military forces were the only authority capable of preventing complete chaos. The displaced persons problem was overwhelming. Millions of people had been moved across Europe by German forces during the war. Jews deported to concentration camps, Poles and Russians conscripted for forced labor, prisoners of war from dozens of countries, refugees fleeing combat. Now they all wanted to go home, but transportation did not exist, borders were unclear, and some discovered they had no homes to return to because their towns had been destroyed or were now in Soviet-occupied territory. The 4th Armored found themselves managing displaced persons camps that held thousands of people from multiple countries, speaking dozens of languages, with conflicting needs and priorities. Medical care was minimal, food was scarce, sanitation was primitive. Allied authorities were doing their best, but best was barely adequate. 4th Armored soldiers who had spent 10 months fighting found themselves distributing food, establishing sick calls, mediating disputes between displaced persons of different nationalities who had grudges dating back decades. It was frustrating, emotionally draining work that had no clear endpoint. The German civilian population presented different challenges. Germany had been thoroughly defeated, economically devastated, politically destroyed. German civilians were trying to survive in a country where normal economic activity had ceased. Factories were damaged or destroyed. Infrastructure was wrecked. The Reichsmark currency was worthless. Barter became the primary means of exchange. Cigarettes for food, food for labor, labor for shelter. Allied occupation policy prohibited fraternization between American soldiers and German civilians, theoretically preventing relationships that might undermine occupying authority. In practice, fraternization happened constantly. Soldiers shared rations with hungry German children. German women offered services, sexual and otherwise, in exchange for food or protection. Soldiers who spoke German found themselves mediating local disputes because they were the only authority figures available. The non-fraternization policy was unenforceable and mostly ignored, though officers made token efforts to maintain the fiction. The demobilization process began in June with the point system. Soldiers accumulated points based on length of service, combat decorations, wounds received, and family status. High-point soldiers would be discharged first and returned to the United States. Low-point soldiers would remain in Europe for occupation duty. The point system created divisions within units. High-point veterans who had fought since Normandy were going home. Low-point soldiers who had joined as replacements in recent months would stay in Germany indefinitely. The veterans felt guilty about leaving, while the war in the Pacific continued. The low-point soldiers felt abandoned, stuck in Europe while their veteran comrades went home. The emotional dynamics were complicated and sometimes bitter. Everyone understood the point system was fair in abstract terms, but fairness did not eliminate resentment. July and August brought steady demobilization. The 4th Armored Division's strength declined from 11,000 men in May to approximately 6,000 by August, as high-point soldiers shipped home and were not replaced. Units that had been at full strength became skeleton formations. Tank battalions that normally had 54 tanks now had 20 or 30. Infantry battalions that normally had 800 men now had 400. The division remained technically operational, but could not have fought effectively if required. This did not matter because Germany was defeated and occupied, but it represented the end of the 4th Armored as a combat formation. The division that had advanced from Normandy to Czechoslovakia was being dismantled piecemeal, one high-point soldier at a time. The veterans who departed in summer and autumn of 1945 carried complex emotions: relief at surviving, grief for comrades who had not, pride in accomplishment, guilt about leaving soldiers still in Germany, uncertainty about civilian life after years in the army. Many veterans struggled to articulate what they had experienced. How do you explain to civilians what combat is like? How do you describe discovering concentration camps? How do you convey the intensity of relationships formed with soldiers who fought beside you for 10 months? Most veterans did not try. They returned home, found jobs, married, started families, and rarely spoke about the war. The experiences were too intense, too personal, to share with people who had not been there. Veterans formed associations, attended reunions, stayed in contact with fellow 4th Armored soldiers, because only people who had shared the experience could understand it. September 1945 brought the official inactivation of the 4th Armored Division's combat elements. The division patch, the red triangle with 4 yellow treads, was still worn by soldiers performing occupation duties, but the combined arms organization that General Wood had built in 1941 no longer existed. Combat Command A, Combat Command B, Combat Command Reserve, the three-headed dragon that had torn across France, were administratively dissolved. Tank battalions were reassigned to other units. Infantry battalions were reconstituted as separate formations. The institutional knowledge, the tactical procedures, the organizational culture that had made the 4th Armored effective, all began dissipating as veteran soldiers departed and the division structure was dismantled. By November 1945, the 4th Armored Division existed primarily as a historical entity, a name on documents, a memory carried by veterans. The final remnants of the 4th Armored were inactivated in March 1946, officially ending the division's World War II service. The division would be reactivated in 1950 during the Korean War, and it would serve through the Cold War, and it would eventually be inactivated again in 1995 after 54 years of existence. But the division reactivated in 1950 was not the division that fought from Normandy to Czechoslovakia. Different soldiers, different equipment, different wars. The 4th Armored of World War II died in stages between May 1945 and March 1946, dismantled by the peace that its victories had helped create. The occupation period revealed something important about warfare. Winning battles is different from winning peace. The 4th Armored had been extraordinarily effective at combat operations. They had advanced further, faster, and with fewer casualties than comparable divisions. But those skills did not translate to occupation duty. Soldiers trained to destroy enemy forces were not naturally suited to managing civilian populations, administering relief supplies, and maintaining civil order. The military is optimized for violence. Occupation requires governance. These missions require different skills, different training, different mentalities. The 4th Armored performed occupation duties adequately but not excellently because excellence in one domain does not guarantee excellence in another. This limitation suggests broader truths about military power. It can destroy effectively, but it struggles to build. It can defeat enemies, but it cannot easily create stable governance. The 4th Armored learned these lessons during summer and autumn of 1945, watching their combat effectiveness become irrelevant in a peacetime role they had not trained for and did not particularly want. They had been warriors. The war ended. Now they were something else, something less clearly defined, performing missions that felt like anticlimaxes after 10 months of combat. Most were grateful the war had ended, but gratitude did not eliminate the sense that occupation duty was a pale shadow of what they had done during combat, and that their purpose, the reason they existed as a division, had dissolved with Germany's surrender. 2015, Fort Benning, Georgia, Armor School Auditorium. A brigadier general stands before 200 officers attending the armor captain's career course, teaching maneuver warfare doctrine. On the screen behind him, photographs from 1944 showing 4th Armored Division Shermans racing through French countryside. The general says, "This is what right looks like. Combined arms, speed, initiative, decentralized command. The 4th Armored Division advanced 1,200 miles in 10 months while suffering moderate casualties because they understood principles that we're still teaching 70 years later." He clicks to the next slide, showing casualty statistics comparing the 4th Armored to other divisions. They prove that aggressive offensive action, properly conducted, actually reduces casualties compared to cautious defense. They prove that tempo matters more than numerical superiority. They prove that training and doctrine can overcome equipment disadvantages. He pauses, looks at the audience. Everything you're learning in this course, every principle of modern armored warfare, was validated by the 4th Armored Division in 1944. They wrote the textbook we're still reading. The officers take notes. Most have never heard of the 4th Armored Division. By the end of this lecture, they will understand why they should have. The 4th Armored Division's statistical record remains remarkable 75 years after World War II ended. 1,260 miles advanced through enemy territory, the longest advance of any American division in the European theater. 280 days of continuous combat operations, among the longest sustained campaigns by any division. 4,483 total casualties, including 1,342 killed in action, remarkably low for a division in sustained combat. Over 140,000 enemy soldiers killed or captured, an extraordinary ratio of enemy casualties to friendly casualties. 74 towns and cities liberated across 5 countries. These statistics quantify achievement but do not fully explain it. Other divisions fought bravely. Other divisions advanced significant distances. What made the 4th Armored different was not their courage, which was common among American divisions, but their effectiveness, which was not. The comparative analysis is revealing. The 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, fought from North Africa through Sicily, through Normandy, through Germany, accumulating an illustrious combat record. They suffered 21,223 casualties. The 2nd Armored Division, Hell on Wheels, fought with distinction from Normandy to Germany, suffering approximately 14,000 casualties. The 3rd Armored Division, Spearhead Division, advanced across Europe with the 1st Army, suffering approximately 14,300 casualties. All 3 divisions earned distinguished reputations and fought effectively, but all 3 suffered casualty rates 3 to 4 times higher than the 4th Armored while advancing comparable or shorter distances. The difference was not in courage or determination. The difference was in doctrine, training, organization, and leadership. The 4th Armored fought smarter, not harder. They achieved more while losing less because they understood that in mobile warfare, speed is armor and initiative saves lives. The doctrinal influence of the 4th Armored Division extended far beyond World War II. Post-war Army studies of the European campaign identified 4th Armored operations as exemplars of effective armored warfare. Field Manual 100-5, the Army's Fundamental Operations Manual, incorporated lessons from 4th Armored operations. Decentralized command, combined arms integration, emphasis on tempo and initiative, organizational flexibility. Cold War armored doctrine, preparing for potential conflict with Soviet forces in Europe, drew heavily on 4th Armored methods. The airland battle doctrine of the 1980s, emphasizing maneuver, speed, and deep operations, was direct intellectual descendant of 4th Armored operations in France. The Gulf War in 1991, where American armored forces conducted a left-hook envelopment that advanced hundreds of miles in days, validated principles that the 4th Armored had demonstrated in 1944. Modern American military doctrine assumes mobility, initiative, and combined arms operations as foundations of effectiveness. All of these assumptions were proven by the 4th Armored Division 75 years ago. The human legacy is more complicated. Approximately 11,000 men served with the 4th Armored Division during World War II, counting original cadre plus replacements. 1,342 died in combat. 3,141 were wounded. The remaining approximately 6,500 survived the war physically intact, though psychological wounds were common and inadequately treated. Post-traumatic stress disorder, though not named or recognized in 1945, affected many. Veterans. Combat fatigue cases diagnosed during the war represented only the most severe psychological casualties. Many veterans carried psychological scars that were never formally diagnosed, never treated, and never acknowledged. They suffered nightmares, startle responses, emotional numbing, difficulties with civilian relationships, and other symptoms that modern medicine recognizes as PTSD. In 1945, these symptoms were dismissed as weakness or character flaws, and veterans learned to hide them. The human cost of the 4th Armored's success included psychological casualties that statistics do not capture and that the Army of 1945 did not adequately recognize. The reunion movement began in the late 1940s as veterans started organizing annual gatherings. 4th Armored Division Association reunions occurred annually for decades, bringing together veterans who wanted to maintain connections with the only people who truly understood what they had experienced. Attendance peaked in the 1970s and 80s when veterans were in their 50s and 60s, healthy enough to travel, retired with time available. Reunions were part social gathering, part therapy session, part memorial service. Veterans told stories, shared photographs, remembered comrades who had died. They also performed an unacknowledged therapeutic function, allowing veterans to process experiences with people who had shared those experiences. The conversations that occurred at reunions about combat, fear, loss, survival, were conversations many veterans never had with their own families. The reunions continued into the 21st century, though attendance declined as veterans aged and died. The final large reunion occurred in 2010. By 2015, fewer than 15 original 4th Armored veterans remained alive. The historical assessment of the 4th Armored Division evolved over decades. Immediately after the war, the division was less famous than the 101st Airborne, less celebrated than the 1st Infantry Division, less prominent in public consciousness than Marine divisions that fought in the Pacific. This relative obscurity persisted for decades. Popular histories of World War II focused on dramatic moments, D-Day, Bastogne, Iwo Jima, rather than sustained operational effectiveness. The 4th Armored's relief of Bastogne was famous, but the 4th Armored itself remained obscure. Military historians recognized the division's significance, but popular understanding lagged behind. This began changing in the 1990s and 2000s, as historians published these detailed studies of the European campaign emphasizing operational effectiveness over dramatic moments. Steven Zaloga, Niklas Zetterling, and other military historians identified the 4th Armored as the most effective American armored division of World War II, based on quantitative analysis of advance rates, casualty ratios, and mission success rates. These historical reassessments elevated the 4th Armored's reputation among scholars, though popular recognition remained limited. The question of whether a progressive doctrine was worth the cost cannot be answered definitively. The 4th Armored's casualty rate was low compared to other divisions, suggesting that Wood's emphasis on speed and maneuver actually saved lives. But 4,483 casualties still represents immense human suffering. Families destroyed, futures eliminated. The men who died would have lived full lives if not for the war. Was their sacrifice necessary? Militarily, yes. Defeating Germany required defeating German armies, which required divisions like the 4th Armored advancing relentlessly. Morally, the question is more complicated. The discovery of concentration camps provided retroactive justification, proof that the war was fighting evil, not just national interests. But the men who died did not know about the camps when they died. They died believing they were fighting for abstract principles, democracy, freedom, defeating fascism, not knowing that they were preventing genocide. Would they have fought differently if they had known? Probably not. Would their sacrifices mean something different? Perhaps. These questions have no satisfactory answers. The technological legacy includes naming the M1 Abrams tank after Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, who commanded the 37th Tank Battalion in the 4th Armored during World War II and later became Army Chief of Staff. The Abrams tank, introduced in 1980, remains the American military's main battle tank in 2025. Naming the tank after Abrams honored his World War II service and symbolized continuity between the 4th Armored Division and modern armored forces. The name connects contemporary soldiers to history, reminding them that their doctrines and methods descend from commanders who proved them in combat 75 years ago. This continuity matters because military effectiveness depends partly on institutional memory, understanding what works and why, learning from historical examples rather than relearning lessons at the cost of lives. The final assessment must acknowledge both achievement and cost. The 4th Armored Division was extraordinarily effective by any measurable standard. They advanced further, faster, and more efficiently than comparable units. They validated mobile warfare doctrine that became foundational to American military thinking. They demonstrated that training, organization, and leadership could overcome equipment disadvantages. They proved that American soldiers could defeat the German Wehrmacht on any battlefield. These achievements mattered strategically, shortened the war, saved lives by ending combat sooner rather than later. But achieving these results required sacrificing 1,342 men killed, wounding 3,000 more, psychologically scarring thousands of survivors. The achievement was real. The cost was real. Both truths coexist without contradiction. War is paradox, necessary and terrible. Victory purchased through sacrifice. Success measured in lives saved and lives lost simultaneously. The 4th Armored Division exists now, primarily as memory. The veterans are gone or nearly gone. The division patch is worn by soldiers and reactivated units that have no direct connection to the World War II division. The battlefields where they fought are now peaceful. The concentration camps they discovered are museums. The towns they liberated have been rebuilt and forgotten the destruction. But the principles they validated remain. Speed matters. Initiative matters. Training matters. Leadership matters. Combined arms coordination matters. These principles, proven in combat from Normandy to Czechoslovakia, guide military operations today. When the Army teaches maneuver warfare, they teach 4th Armored methods. When historians analyze effective military operations, they study 4th Armored campaigns. When veterans gather to remember World War II, they tell